And maybe I'll officially say, hi everyone, bonjour tout le monde, welcome online and in person to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you so much for joining us for Homemaking Symposium, these conversations at the intersection of research and creation, craft and home. We've got a full day of activity here today, so I will be passing the floor to Elaine Patterson to get us started in just a minute. But I did just want to let you know first where we are, whether you're joining us online or in person. We are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Fourth Space is a public space here at Concordia University, whereby we work with faculty, students, and staff to help activate the ongoing research projects and initiatives with the goal of co-creating knowledge and building community. And we do this by producing daily hybrid events and activities that are free and open to the public, to all. So this week it's been our pleasure to collaborate with the organizers and all of the participants online and in person of the Homemaking project. It's been great to have you all here in the space with us, and I see that Elaine is now ready to say a few official words of welcome. So I pass the floor to you, Elaine.
Sorry, Anna, I missed my cue. I was looking at chairs. So good morning, everyone. Bonjour et bon matin à tous. I'm Elaine Patterson. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm a professor in craft studies in the Department of Art History here at Concordia in the Faculty of Fine Arts. And I see her on her phone in the back, but I'm still going to introduce my collaborator, Molly Claire Gillette. Maybe she can give a wave in the back, a colleague in the interdisciplinary studies and practices area of the Faculty of Fine Arts here at Concordia with me. C'est avec plaisir que nous vous recevons chaleureusement à l'Université Concordia et à Montréal pour le colloque Homemaking. The Homemaking project is a series of events, including maker residencies, a workshop series, a week-long research creation showcase that's all around us in the space, and this hybrid symposium at the intersections of two concepts, craft and home. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this event's home, Concordia University, is located on stolen Indigenous lands. Molly Claire and I recognize the tensions inherent in hosting an event focused on the home, or the concept of home, when we ourselves are uninvited guests on the land unceded of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. And so we invite reflection, discussion, and action into this space of tension, and encourage those joining us virtually also to learn and reflect on the land on which you are attending this event. The idea for this homemaking project began as Molly Claire was about to defend her richly interdisciplinary PhD thesis on focusing on Irish lace in March of 2020. So maybe you can anticipate where this is going next. We had a lot of this planned then, but the pandemic put a pause on everything, while at the same time seeming to make the themes of home and craft seem more timely than ever. Fast forward 3 years, and here we are. Molly Claire and I are now colleagues in the Faculty of Fine Arts together, as well as collaborators on this project. With gratitude also to our shared mentor and friend, not to mention the brilliant scholar of 19th century home arts, Dr. Janice Helen, for bringing us together and for supporting our mutual and sustained interest in exploring the intersections of craft and home. So for those of you who don't know, Janice is to me as I am to Molly Claire, in other words, doctoral supervisor, colleague, and friend. Molly Claire and I believe that the terms craft and home are expansive, but also unstable, contingent on issues of labor, land, identity, belonging, gender, race, class, and clearly we aren't the only ones. The response to our call was overwhelming in the most positive possible way. With such contingent and contested ranges of meanings, the notions of both craft and home have been fruitful areas of scholarly inquiry and creative work for the many contributors to the Homemaking Symposium. And some of you may have seen that yesterday while we were meeting the makers, and those about to unfold with presentations now that address critical issues of making, dwelling, place, gender, sustainability, identity, belonging, decolonization, and more. And so through this homemaking project, we hope to create a transdisciplinary platform for dialogue on these critical issues, bringing together scholars and makers at the intersection of craft and home. And we hope this will foster a continued community of craft as well going forward. So thank you all for joining us, whether in person or virtually, at the Homemaking Symposium, 3 days of research and creation that conclude the homemaking workshop series and research creation showcase. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. That happened all of this weekend, was really enlivening in the space, I have to say. We'd also like to acknowledge the support of our partners at Concordia University, so the Textiles and Materiality Cluster in the Milieu Institute, the library, which is just upstairs, where we're going to be all day tomorrow, and of course, today especially, the fourth space. On behalf of myself and Marie-Claire, a special thank you to our team, Marie-Ève Castonguay, Max Delmar, Anna Audet, Tori Macbeth, and Marie Taoko. We'd also like to thank the panel chairs, Juliette Bergeron, Pramila Chutari, Morris Fox, Gina Granter, Alex Noel, and Andrew Rubiniak. This would not have been possible without all of you, so a huge thank you. And so a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over the mic. There are bathrooms. I know this sounds like a bizarre thing to have to announce, but the bathrooms are actually under construction, the obvious ones. And so if you go out the door behind you to the right, there's the Desev Cinema bathrooms have been unlocked for us to use. So that's where they are, out and to your right, past the security desk. There's also going to be refreshments over here that will be put out all through the day at different moments for you to enjoy. And there are printed programs for you to share and peruse. There's full abstracts and bios as well in both English and French. And the QR code that you might have seen around or at the back of the program also brings you to that page. So if you want to know more in depth about the bios and the abstracts, you can go there. And so the programming we've created is designed to offer a relaxed and engaging atmosphere, but voices carry. So if you can just be mindful of that as you wander around the space. And we do encourage you today to get up and move around, because while we're here, we're amidst all of the work and we won't be able to do that tomorrow. So please do take advantage of that and feel free. Just remember that, as I say, the voices sometimes carry. And so that's it for me this morning. And so I'm delighted to hand the mic over to Morris Fox to introduce our first kitchen table talk this morning.
Is this mic? Oh, it is working. Hi, everyone. I'm Morris Fox. I'm a PhD student in interdisciplinary humanities here at Concordia. It's my great pleasure to chair this kitchen table session, Togetherness. So I'm just going to introduce all of our wonderful panelists by way of their bios, and then quickly talk about the format of the kitchen table session. So Reihan Ebrahimi is an Iranian-born ceramic artist who lives between Jojage, Montreal, and Tehran. She moved to Canada in 2015 and received her BFA in ceramics in 2020 from Concordia University. The ceramic sculptures and installations of Reihan revolve around a constant dialogue between the dichotomy of culture and nature. Her work is a poetic exploration of conscious and unconscious questions about memory, cultural identities, and uncertainties of displacement. Cilia Sawadogo is a multi-directional clay and media artist with a long background in animated filmmaking and a more recent practice in ceramics. Through her work, Cilia examines the human condition and the impact on Earth's environment. Inspired by her travels and Euro-African background, the artist explores the ongoing struggles of women and race, reflecting on the minusculeness of humanity's consciousness versus the overwhelming of space and infinity. Sawadogo follows an instinctive creative process when working with clay and frame-by-frame media. Gabby Scope, over here, sorry, is a professional ceramic artist based in Montreal. She graduated from the Concordia University Ceramic and Sculpture program in 1991. Working primarily with hand-building techniques, she uses the vessel form as means of communication. Her artistic career started with an artist residency at the renowned Banff Center and continued with regular participation in sales and art exhibitions over the years. Rachel Michi, hey Rachel, is an activist and potter who has clay, whose passion is clay, Working with clay over the last 10 years, Michi makes functional and happy pottery using a wheel for her work. She took pottery classes at the Montreal Visual Arts Center and the Halliburton School of Art and Design and has participated in many exhibitions. Saba Heravi, hi Saba, is an Iranian-Canadian artist based in Jojage, Montreal. Her work explores the idea of home, memory, and identity. Saba graduated with a BFA from Concordia University in 2019, and her work has been exhibited in several exhibitions in Montreal. Terry Cherney, hi Terry, having taken courses during the past 15 years at the Visual Arts Center and at 1001 Pots, Terry Cherney has evolved from being a part-time potter making functional pieces on the wheel, to one who combines wheel making and hand building to create purposefully imperfect functional and sculptural pieces. Terry organized and participated in several PotsUniques pop-up ceramic sales during the spring and summer of 2021 and 2022. She has also helped organize and participate in a group ceramic exhibition and sale in December 2022 at the CCGV under the auspices of PotsUniques. Pauline Desjardins, who's not here with us in person, is a full-time ceramicist who has worked on creative pieces and dishware for several Montreal restaurants. She has participated in the group exhibition at the CCGV and several pop-up pottery sales. She holds a bachelor degree in fine arts from Concordia University, and her dishware appears in the recipe book of chef Jean Soulard, Cannabis en Cuisine. So before I pass the microphone off, I just want to remind everyone, because this is a kitchen table presentation after the talk, instead of doing a formal Q&A, the idea is to come with coffee, tea, over and see all of the work and to have kind of one-on-one or more informal questions with all of the artists who are here today. If you also have any questions that you would like to field before that, just raise your hand at the end of the session. I'm happy to facilitate that as well. So without any further ado, welcome. Are you mic'd up?
I'm mic'd up, but do you hear me? Yeah, it's on me. So I hope it's not too noisy. So welcome. Thank you everyone for having us. Thank you Ellen and Molly for this wonderful project. We are very pleased. I talk on behalf of our groups to participate in this wonderful project. So our project was not supposed to be in the beginning be shown in a place or exhibited. So we kind of in resonating with your idea, it's kind of was super organic and homey in a way when we started. So this was, I'm gonna share this presentation with you, some slides. How can I make it big? Just a second. Sorry. So this full screen, it's always, I know full screen, but okay, here. Sorry. Cilia, can you? No. Yeah, here, maybe slideshow. Yeah, sorry for that, some technical issues. So our Togetherness project, that's how we called it. So it started basically on first year of COVID, when COVID hit us. There was the first lockdown, and with my partner, we were talking, how can we make a conversation about this new condition that we are having, each of us in our community. So me, as a potter, I share studio with a few of these ladies. Some of them are upstairs in our building. So we at the lockdown time, we couldn't see each other. We had to do a schedule, go to the studio one day per week, and it was a tough period. So we couldn't see each other, we were not in touch. So I thought with this idea when talking with my partner that how can we create, communicate through our, what we do. So for us, making the pottery or ceramics. So yeah, a dialogue, an idea of a dialogue in a way that form can communicate. So this collaborative project, I suggested it. We started talking on the Zoom about it because we had some previous experience in sales of pottery together, but this was completely a new condition. And so we thought, so I pitched the idea, and all of us, we developed it in a better way, and we put some loose guidelines so that it could be open enough, but at the same time, we can put our work together in a meaningful way. So if you can imagine, maybe some of you know about a broken telephone or cadavre ski of the surrealist movements, that they start a painting and they pass it to the next person. The next person, she or he starts drawing on it. Or so for us, like as Iranians, we have this poetry citing that it's like an open, like a game. When in our spare time, we like from the poetry that we remember, we recite something, and then the next person use the last letter of the last word, and then here she recites a new poem. So and then the game goes on until somebody's run out of memory. So yeah, that was mainly the idea, and so we developed it. And then for our guideline, I also suggested this poetry that it was really resonated with the situation we were in. So this is from a poet, Saadi Shirazi, from 13th century Iran. The poetry is also on UN wall for the building in New York. So it says, human beings are members of a whole in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. So this poem became our central point, but at the same time open enough so that we think about like our condition, the human condition during the COVID time. So we started in two groups, and we started in two groups. This was in two parallel groups in month of February that we started. So two people started creating the work. Once they were done, they passed their work to the next person. So, and then the next person to the next person without seeing the previous person's work. So until month of May, we covered the 7 person. And it was in June time, we gathered all at Gabby's garden to exchange and talk about our process, what we did, what we learned. And at this point, we hadn't glazed our work. It was just a bisque. So in ceramics, we have two sections, one for bisquing the clay and then glazing it in the second fire. So this was still the bisque time, and so we started exchanging some ideas. What we went through, it was a very casual and joyful meeting because still at that time, parties was forbidden. So having seeing each other at Gabby's garden was wonderful. So yeah, we had this very casual exchange, and yeah, so a few things to reflect on was when COVID happened, it brought some silence to all of us. And we as potters, of course, we are very like working with clay and ceramics material and processes already is part of our nature to become patient. And this was going hand in hand with the situation we were in. But the problem was that we didn't have as much as access to a studio as before. And some of us, we did our work at home. So we fit well to this project when we talked with Ellen and Molly about like how our process went. So nothing was really planned, no exhibition, no, it was very like just for our joy and to just understand the uncertain situation of the COVID, which has surrounded us. So we can also think about it as a kind of like a potluck, or like being invited to a party, like being invited in a home, but there was no party, so it was just us. So like we made the form, the work to do that gathering for us. And then the time that each of us had to reflect on the work, like receiving from this person, not talking as much, it was just the form, the colors, the textures, and the ideas that was coming with that person and the situation she was experiencing. So yeah, I think also it was in a way a healing process for all of us. It brought a feeling of intimacy, and again, like clay as a medium, it already embodies all these characteristics. So we were maybe part of the lucky ones during COVID. So we got even more close to our favorite medium. So I will handle it to our members to talk about their works. But before that, I would just want to say like how the way it is set up now, because we were 7 people, you have to kind of like see the dates when they started, and then when they pass it to the next person, how you'll see the timeline and how we proceed during the COVID time. So some of us started in winter, and our last person finished in summertime. You could kind of trace how the work develops and how individual they're still. So yeah, I will just hand it to, no, I started, I'm sorry. It's here.
Good morning, everyone.
Gabby.
My name is Gabi Scope. It's a pleasure to be part of the Homecoming conference exhibit and talk. My work together apart is part of the ceramic exhibit together. I was one of the first artists to start the project in February, and the mood we were in was a bit dark because of all the restrictions and our inability to work in the studio whenever we wanted. We had to come maybe for a few hours each week into the studio, so it lent itself to working much smaller than traditionally I'm working. And if you look at around the exhibit, everybody kind of tended to work on multiple pieces and smaller in order to, because you had to plan carefully because of the material. I read through the project poem, and I decided that I will concentrate on the word essence and soul. And the forms that I chose were inspired by archaeological shapes of ossuaries, ancient granaries, columbriums. So it was like a cave kind of thing. I used in my work, I used the traditional way of building with coils. And after I used black clay, and I whitewashed it with porcelain clay. So in order to put the images. And the images were trying to put us in a different mood using basically drawings and images that we can all recognize that were inspired by different artists, by writing. I just tried to make it in a way that the viewer could connect with those elements. And as you can see, there is images of the coronavirus because it was everywhere, and airplanes, syringes, writing, birds. I was thinking about different artists when I was working on it, and some of the readings that I was reading at the time. I was reading Andrea Wolf. I decided to read all her books again, and especially Chasing Venus, which I just loved because of all the adventures and how people were able to plan years in advance and live their life, which we were really restricted in doing, and use the ancient symbols for water and things like that. Some of the things that I wrote was stand up and shed the bondage of chaos. You have dwelled long enough in the valley of tears. Using those references that's how I wanted to reach the viewer, that even in a situation like that, we can find the humor and the connection with people from different cultures. And that's it. And after me, I passed my work to Rochelle Michi, and she's sitting there. And
Hi, I'm Rochelle. When I saw Gabby's composition, it made me think of the indigenous sweat lodges. So I saw the forums as places where people go to heal their body and soul. And I also saw on her pieces, she had written COVID-19. So I thought this is probably places where people go, they're separate but together, and they go there to heal. So that made me think of drum circles. And the reason I thought of drum circles was just the week prior to seeing Gabby's project, a friend of mine was alone in Florida. She had gone there before the pandemic and decided she would stay there. So she was rather lonely. And one day she went to the beach and there was a drum circle. So people were apart, further apart than you normally be. They were drumming apart and dancing apart. And she found that very healing to her soul because she was alone. So she started going to these drum circles quite regularly and had sent me several videos of it. So I sort of thought, well, this is sort of the same thing. It's healing together but apart. So that I was sort of motivated to create a djembe drum and have people dancing around the drum. My pieces are made out of stoneware, and I like when I make my pieces that they could be reused later for something else. I don't like that just put away in a cupboard. So the top of the drum, the top is removed and can be turned upside down to hold a candle, and inside the drum in the sort of base, you can also put a candle. That's why I have the holes in it, so that light comes out. And also to reflect, the light coming out of the drum is also to me, the warmth and the light, which would sort of promote healing. And the people I have around, as you can see, the cylinders can be for flowers or for utensils, for whatever anybody wants to put in. So I like the idea that they can be used. So again, the theme of what I've made is healing together, but apart, and healing in rhythm. So after I finished my project, Saba, I took a look at it, and I'll pass the microphone to Saba.
Thank you, Rochelle. Hi, I'm Saba. When I saw Rochelle's work, because we didn't talk to each other about it and what we meant behind what we created, I saw the form of her piece, which was like a metal object that was placed in the middle, and there was other vessels that were placed around it, so kind of like a circle around it. So I decided to go off of the form that she had created, the composition that she had created, And I also made a vessel, a larger vessel that would place in the middle with spouts on the sides. And under each spout, there is a cup that is placed, but they're all different in shapes and sizes. And to me, those like cups, they represent people, they represent us, where we like carry our experiences, identities, history. We're all different. But in the end, we all have the same like basic needs. We want to be heard, we want to be understood, we want to be seen. And to me, this whole piece together kind of talks about equal distribution and how important it is to have fairness and equality in our communities, and for all of us to have the same opportunity, however different we are. And this work mainly has the idea of community, and that's central to it. And the cups are all connected together with the placement of the like the middle vessel. And all the cups rely on each other to function. This whole sculpture relies on each of those cups to rely on each other, kind of like us as humans in our community. We rely on each other to move forward, to improve in our like daily needs, in our own life, and also in the community, and move towards positive change. And so that's kind of like why I called my work Vessels of Change. And I think that to me, that's a definition of togetherness, how we are placed beside each other, and how we interact to each other, and how we contribute to our community. And then after me was Terry, and I'll pass it on to her.
Thank you, Saba. I'm Terry. I loved Saba's piece, and I was inspired by the shape of her piece, the circular bowl in the middle and the spouts. And Saba's piece, and we, as Saba mentioned, we didn't speak to each other at all. The idea was we had to look at the work of the previous person, get our own impressions, and be inspired by that work. So when I looked at Saba's piece, I saw two things. First of all, the circle with the spokes coming out of it reminded me of the coronavirus molecule. That was the negative side. And then when I looked at the spouts and the little cups, I thought, wow, this is a nurturing picture. This is the big vessel with its spouts nurturing the little cups all around it. And the theme of our talk, of our group, we did originally talk actually about having a show at one time. We didn't have a specific show in mind, but when we made these pieces, our aim was that eventually we would show all these pieces, and we would show the fact that we were influenced by each other. So when I looked at the nurturing part of Saba's piece, that was what clicked for me really. And most of my work in the past has been wheel throwing, but I wanted to do something that would be hand built. And I was lucky to be the last person in our group. So when I made it, it was the month of May, and I could work in my backyard, and I could roll clay out and make hand built cylinders. And so I decided to make hand built cylinders that would carry the notion of nurturing. So my piece is called Nurture, and I would have spouts in my piece where the taller cylinders would nurture the shorter cylinders. And so that was kind of the beginning. And then I decided that the proportions of the cylinders would be roughly the golden mean, or the Fibonacci series, if you're familiar with that. It's in music, it's in art. The paintings of Mark Rothko, for example, when you look at the paintings of Mark Rothko, his horizon line is usually about 5/8 the height of the work. And you don't have to know that, but for some reason, that proportion is very pleasing to the human eye. It seems to be an instinctive thing. So my pieces are not strictly Fibonacci, but they're a little bit. They're sort of 2, 3, 5, 8 roughly, which is roughly a Fibonacci, but I didn't stick to it so exactly. I just liked the idea. And then I had used the hemp leaf motif before on some cups that I made, and I decided to put the hemp leaf motif on the cylinders using a wax relief method. So I use wax relief and black engobe on white clay. And then I should say that I didn't have access to a kiln or glazes at all during COVID, but one of the other aspects of Togetherness is that we really helped each other. And I have to say that Gabby and Cilia helped me out a lot because they had kiln and glaze access, and they glazed and fired my work for me. So it really was an incredibly satisfying process. What I was happy about, in my experience, pottery has a lot of chance involved. You start with something, and you often end up with something that wasn't what you thought it would be, and then you have to decide if you like it, if you like the surprise or you don't like the surprise. And what I found was I liked the hemp leaf right off, but I didn't realize how organic it would look. And when the piece was finished, I was really happy to see that the hemp leaf added to the organic look of the piece, but also the clay is speckled stoneware. And the speckles come through the clear glaze. It's such a simple glaze. It's just a clear glaze on the black engobe and on the white clay. But the speckles come through. And I love the speckles because they're right in the clay. It's a completely organic idea. And yet they add a decorative element just from the speckles. And when it was finished, the speckles ran a little bit. And so to me, they started to look like birch trees. And I thought, wow, I wasn't even planning this. So I've got the theme of nurture, and I've also got these birch trees happening here. Anyway, I think it was a wonderful project, and I applaud Reihan for starting it and getting us going. And I'm grateful to have been part of this project, and I think it's wonderful that we're doing this project all together with the Homemaking Symposium. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I started, we did two parallels. So I started in February, like Gabby did. And as you can see, our February pieces are a little bit darker than the spring pieces. You can see the difference. So yeah, I mean, I called it a drowning. I called it 1%. It was influenced by really the mass hysteria that we were all experiencing online. It started, of course, with the with the poem, where, you know, it's a poem that talks about people having to care for each other and be respectful and loving, and one person cannot be, you know, uncaring when others are in pain. And I felt kind of angry, I have to admit, because, you know, during that time, Canada was closing their borders. The choices of closing of borders were very political. They were terrible. I found there was just such, you know, incredible discrimination towards certain countries. I'm of African German descent. And I always felt that, you know, whoever came from the African continent, if you try to immigrate to Canada, good luck. You know, it's very different for people who come from a so-called third world country. So the choices we made at that time were really making me angry. And I felt that that was sort of influencing what I was producing as I was working. And I really felt that there was this sort of group of people who were sort of left to themselves in a situation that was really getting out of control. And then there was a group of people who had access to much more than the rest of the planet. And this was a planetary situation. And the choices that were made, you know, in Western countries versus countries that didn't have the same means were really shocking for certain things. Obviously, there was also a good side where a lot of people were trying to help, we're trying to also talk against these choices that were made. So there was really this online and TV and everything where you had this back and forth about yes or no, these are the people who we will help, these are the people who will not help, these are the people who are accepted, who are the people who are not accepted. So if you look at my piece on the top, you can't really see it. There's this little entonnoir, like a little space where there are a couple of heads that are trying to get through, and then there are my 1% people who have the choice, who can decide if these people will have access to resources, to vaccines, to everything. So I think that was a reaction mainly to everything we were experiencing at that time. And then of course, winter wasn't helping. And I was working in my garage by myself, which didn't help either. So, I might have been influenced a little bit by that too. Yeah. So I think that's really what the piece is about. It was an illustration of the things that we were living through. So, my background is also as a filmmaker. I'm an animator. I tell stories. So I had the need to sort of tell little situations, little stories, little everyday life moments that you could see there in the lower part, where people were struggling, where parents were trying to help their children, where people are getting separated on borders. So it was illustrating a little bit the things that we have all seen during the COVID crisis. So yeah, I think that's what I have to say about my piece. It's made out of clay. It's been fired. Voila.
So it's me again. Yeah. So when I received Cilia's work, it was kind of that few people on the top, and those kind of sinking on the bottom was something obvious that's directly communicated with me. And during that situation, for me, it was in the month of March. It was already a bit heavy, like anyone else, to handle the situation. So my sanctuary became the clay and form. So when I use pottery, sometimes when I say like culture and nature, it's like part of my practice. That sometimes I really do quite research-based art that is fed by politics, social situation, art history. But my other part is then I get fed up with this too much language dominant thoughts. I kind of take a shelter on form and clay. And that's such a bliss. So for this, I just, I kept the whole ideas apart. I started to look at the thing as in a formal way. So right away, I could just thought of like simple forms of hierarchy and little spheres. Like so I kind of look at it in a way that, okay, now I'm like so fed up with this situation. I have no means to handle it as an individual. But what if I start to imagine, just imagine a new way out of this? We knew like how this COVID thing kind of changed our lives in different ways. So I thought, if I can just imagine to break that hierarchy, and then so right away the heads became the sphere for me, and then during the process, the things got some distorted and deformed, and I appreciate it. So as who was like Terry was pointing, there are so many surprises in pottery and ceramics. So I started seeing this cycle of spheres, and so through the colors, the glazes I was already exploring, I did this range of colors, and then so imagining our universes despite our problems and everything, an attempt to get closer to the circle. And the circle already as a form, it's it has a special place in all cultures. So yeah, more or less that was for me, and I truly enjoyed it because again, it was also like a healing process. And after me, I passed my work to Pauline. So Pauline, she's not here today, but Gabby is gonna read her statement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so Pauline was next, and she worked in April. So as you can see, it's a bit more hopeful and joyous. She was inspired by the poem that is in the UN building in the Hall of Nations. She felt that togetherness means that we're standing together as a society. And when she looked at Reihan's work and saw all the balls, she looked at them as seeds. And she wanted to open them and develop them as vessels. And she put in the flowers because it was spring, and her feeling was that as vessels we nurture each other as a society. And she just wished to have a positive take on this time of COVID, because we still did continue to communicate, and we did try to stay in touch with people and reach out to our community and our families and our society. And bringing joyfulness was the essence and the soul of her work. That's it.
So we are on time now.
Do you have some closing remarks you'd like to say?
Yeah, like very shortly. But it was so surprising to all of us after when we finished the work and we saw it together. We kind of felt like there is a ritualistic aspect to it. So all of us, we have like multiple forms. In a way, they are surrounded around something. Like, and this was completely without any plans or intentions. It was very brilliant to just see how, in a way, we have our own subjective ways towards seeing things, but at the same time, this sense of community, it's in the air, it's in all of us. We breathe in, whether we plan for it or not. So just looking at the work together, I think it was a miracle. Like we enjoyed it.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your work. It's so fascinating. I was writing notes and just thinking about how do we pass time, and then clay being this time-based medium as well as just how do we work through our feelings about space, loneliness, togetherness, so many rich topics. So my brain is going to be spinning for the next couple of days thinking about it.
That's good.
So just to wrap up, if we have any questions, I'm happy to field questions here, but also I really encourage everyone to come up and talk to our hosts to be a bit more informal, but I understand that's not how everyone works, and that's totally great. So yeah, does anyone have any questions, or first maybe a bit of applause would be nice. Yeah. Thank you all. Yes. Oh, we're going to grab a mic for you, sorry.
Thanks so much to the panel. This was such a fabulous presentation, and just lovely to see how each one of you worked with each other. So my question really is about the stories that emerge out of the work that you're doing. Did you share the stories with each other before the other person made the response? Okay. I just wanted to clarify that.
A resounding no, but I'm going to pass it to Cilia.
Yeah, the idea was actually that nobody was supposed to know what was the idea behind it. So we were very secretive about it. And what we did, we had a mentor. So because we were like two parallels, so we had actually another person we could talk about it, but that person was not going to do their work based on ours. But the person who was following us, we're not supposed to know anything. That was really, because it was how the other person was going to read what they saw. That was the important part.
I thought that was the most powerful part of it, but I wasn't certain if I heard clearly that had you shared the work with each other or not. Thank you.
We shared it later.
Yeah.
Just the visual element of it. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, I just want to add one thing. One of the things I think we probably should mention is that this is actually the second exposition of this show. In other words, I think it's wonderful that it is the second time. We had our first exhibit of this Togetherness project at the CCGV in December of 2022, when we had a sale upstairs. There was a gallery downstairs, and we had all the pieces set up in sort of in an order, so you could see which piece influenced which piece. And that was the first manifestation, really, of an exposition of our show. And that made us very, very happy, because when, as Reihan was explaining, when we first did this, we did it each in our own home or our own studio, and the rest you know already, but we didn't know whether or when it would be shown. And so when we did it in December at the CCGV, that was wonderful. And to have it have a second life here is also really wonderful. And who knows, maybe we'll have a third manifestation somewhere.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah, just right behind you in the.
Hi, everybody. I'm just wondering, just you mentioned possibly there might be a third manifestation of this show, but now that you have spoken with each other and shared kind of your thinking and your thoughts and your ideas about your work when you were making it, does anybody feel like they would like to extend their work a little further, or does anybody feel like they would like to do anything different?
Yeah, if you, I have, no, I think for this specific project, I personally was so honest with what was going on and how I felt and how the work I did. It was one of those projects that was so intuitive and so not planned. So I found this type of originality in it, in my feelings, that I won't touch it because it was part of my life back then in that condition. But of course, I'm developing my glazes, which were used in this project. It goes on, but for the form and like how it came up together, I personally was quite happy with it.
I find your question very interesting because I feel that we already actually evolved somehow. Because from the first time that we actually showed the work to each other in the garden to the exhibition at the CCGV, where we had more like it was really like an exhibition, you know, there was a little bit of a talk, but we didn't really have that where we had to actually sort of really think about it and bring it forward and also maybe put it more into context. I think there was an evolution. And then also technically speaking, when I'm thinking about the last exhibition you had, I forget the title, but that one, yeah, I think it's almost a continuation of that. So I feel that, yes, there is an evolution, but not like specifically on the piece, you know? And yeah, I mean, why not? You know, we could definitely work. I know you have.
I just wanted to say that we are working together because we are sharing studios and we are in the same building. We have a studio down and up, and we do keep on going back and forth and showing each other the pieces. And the 7 of us are in a group called PotsUniques, and we're doing other things together. So I think realistically, we are going to have more projects together.
For me, I do basically just, I make functional pieces. And I think what was good doing this is I had to kind of push myself to go past my comfort zone. So I started using colored clays we call slip. So I was experimenting with these, but after I did them, I thought, wow, I'd like to make some lamps, because again, we have the light and with dancing figures, which I haven't got. It takes time because I have to now experiment with colored slips, but it was very good for me to push myself outside the comfort zone and just doing functional pieces. But it will help me with my functional pieces. As you can see, every time I make something, I think, can I reuse it later? So yeah, it was a very good question. Thank you.
So that's all our time. We are about to break into a coffee break, so I just really encourage everyone here to, we have 5 minutes?
Okay.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I have a remark.
I thought we were out of time.
Okay.
So the coffee break is about 5 minutes. Thank you. But yeah, during that coffee break,
So I
please
can
talk
still
to everyone.
continue. Well, I just thought about one thing that maybe will be a good feed also to the concept of the home crafting. So, like I did my studies here at Concordia, and ceramics has been. I heard from my professors that for so long, the medium has been for debate to be classified as part of fine arts or not. And it's so amazing that I'm also like a mix. I do functional stuff, and sometimes I do like more artistic projects. But I think the connecting medium, that it's the clay that connect us together. And from coming from different backgrounds, ages, and everything. In the end, we end up making, crafting, and that's crafting versus creating has some heavy discussions behind it that are topics of intellectual thoughts for academia and everything. But
sorry, we're really out of time, so we're just gonna. It's a great question.
I thought it's
no. It's
more minutes.
5 more minutes was for our coffee break. I'm so sorry. Thank you all so much. So just another round of applause for everyone.
Sorry.
No worries.
I thought like 5 minutes. I thought like we are early.
Elaine, am I right in thinking the next thing is going to be fully virtual? Okay. Okay. Perfect. So maybe folks, if you're in the room, you might want to turn your chairs to face the screen for the next bit. Make yourselves comfortable, have your coffee, and come back and do that. Thank you. Hi, Marina. Missed your question. If you had your hand up, we were running out of time here. No, you're good? Okay, thank you. So just to let you know again, to the folks online who are listening in, we are going to take a little break here before the next panel. So we're going to pin that little homemaking symposium card here to the Zoom, and we'll welcome you back in a few minutes for a virtual panel. Thank you.
So I'll say that again, sorry about that. I apologize for the delay. Because this is our first online panel, perhaps we can start by getting each of our panelists who are joining us virtually to just introduce themselves by their full name, so we can check for clarity of the audio. There we go.
I'm Nicole Rudolph. Hi, I'm Pınar, Melis, Yelsalı, Parmaksız.
And we have a third panelist. Are you with us, Mirielle? Are you able to turn on your audio? Okay, just 1 second. The audio is disabled.
Hi, there you go. Hi.
Perfect. We love the challenges of doing things online. Okay, now that we can hear everybody, we're going to jump right into things because we're a little bit short on time. My name is Alex. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Art Education here at Concordia University, and I'll be chairing, you might be channeling something. I'll be chairing our first panel today, which is titled Homemaking Practices, International Perspectives Part 1, which suggests Part 2. And I'm just going to give a quick introduction to our speakers. So today we have 3 presenters with us. Our first speaker will be Dr. Mirielle Risse, who's an associate professor of literature and cultural studies at Dhofar University in Oman. whose research focuses on Dhofari cultures and histories, comparative literature, and intercultural communication. Next, we have Dr. Pınar Melis Yelsalı, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Bahçeşehir University in Istanbul, Turkey. And finally, we have Dr. Nicole Rudolph, who is an associate dean at Adelphi University and a specialist of French civilization, who focuses on the history of domestic space. I thank you all for being here with us today. I'm going to hand it over to you to begin your presentations, starting with Dr. Risse.
Hi. We are hoping this works. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me just put my timer on. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I will be talking about crafting a home, interior home design in southern Oman. So there is a map to sort of situate you for Oman. I live in the southern region, which is called Dhofar. If you see the town in bold at the bottom, Salalah, that's on the Indian Ocean, and the other main town is Thamreit, which is right above it. It's right on the edge of the empty quarter. So this is what the exterior of houses look like. As you can see, they're very large because you usually have a senior man, his wife, married sons, their wives and children, unmarried daughters, perhaps divorced daughters, perhaps married daughters with children who have come home for a visit, and usually a few other relatives, elderly parents, uncles, aunts, etc. There's usually 30 or more people in a house. So here are more traditional, here are more modern. First ones were traditional. These are the more modern designs, house designs. So I just wanted to show you some house plans just to kind of situate you within a house. This would be a very small house, probably 2 married brothers or perhaps parents with several children. The modulus is the meeting room for guests, and the sala is the living room for people who live in the house, close friends or family. So you can see that. So this is a divided house, meaning it's a house with 2 floors, which are separate. And this one, for example, might have the senior couple and 2 married sons with their wives and some small children. You can again see how there's the 2 living rooms at the front of the house. Here is a family house plan. So this would be a house plan example for one of the larger houses that you saw. You can see the modulus on the lower left. Behind the modulus in the middle of the left-hand side is a bedroom, which would be for a senior person because it's so close to the living rooms, and it's on the ground floor so they don't have to walk upstairs. On the right-hand side, you see the main sala, and then behind that is a small family sala, which would be just for family and probably not decorated. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see a suite, which would be for a married son, wife, and several children, and bathroom. And then on the floor above this, there would probably be 6 suites. So most houses in Dhofar have 2 front doors. The main one, which is larger, more decorated, and usually faces the street, leads directly into the interior of the house to the main hallway. And the one that you can see on the right would lead into the guest living room called the modulus. So here are 2 examples of modulus. So you can see that almost all of the decoration is on the ceiling and on the floor. So the ceilings have plasterwork, recessed lights, they have color, they have chandeliers. You can see in the photo on the left, the door that leads to the outside, and on the right-hand side, the door that leads to the interior of the house, so that people can come and go and bring food, but guests would never be in any other room except this one. You can see that the seating is always all the way around the corners of the room. And in the middle, you have rugs, sometimes tile work on the floor, coffee tables, and that's it. So you can see there's no other decoration. The big white thing in the middle of the left photo is actually a TV screen. So if you open the main door, you would see a hallway like this, which again has a lot of decoration on the ceiling and no visual clues of what room might be where, no other decorations. The gold squares in the hallway have inside of them geometric gold designs. That's the only decoration. So here are 2 examples of the sala, the family living room. And you can see the one on the left is very plain, but it still has plasterwork on the ceiling, fluorescent lights, the fan, the AC, seating all the way around the walls, and a carpet in the middle. The one on the right-hand side is a little more fancy, but with the same basic decorative ideas. So some married couples have a small suite to themselves, which would include a small sitting area. So here are two examples of that. You can see that almost all the decorative choices are with curtains, ceiling, seating, maybe a little bit on the floor. But there's no bookcases, photos, other things. And I want to emphasize that these photos are not taken, you know, like showing a new house where everything's put away or cleaned up because somebody's come to take a photo. Nope, this is what it looks like all the time. Bedrooms, very plain with the furniture. I mean, very decorated furniture, but only a few pieces because the houses are built of cement block. There's no closets, so that you have these freestanding wardrobes with the clothes hangers. The bed, you have the chest of drawers and then the vanity. Kitchens are utilitarian. They are not decorated for beauty or for aesthetic pleasure. They are working spaces. People usually go into them only to eat and prepare food and to clean up. So the table in the left-hand example of the kitchen would be used for preparing food, or maybe one person quickly eating a meal alone. But you can tell that those are workspaces. So there's two kinds of bathrooms. Both the decoration is mainly with tile work. The one on the left is the kind that are near the front of the house, near the living rooms that guests and other people would use, like family members. So you can see the one on the left has two parts to it. So the first part is sinks to wash your hand, and then an interior door that leads to a toilet and a shower. The bathroom on the right-hand side is the kind that is used near bedrooms or is attached to a bedroom. And you can't see because it's sort of cut off, but there is a sink on the left-hand side, and then the toilet and the shower. And this would be used by one person only at a time. The only exception is a mother with a small child. So I'm really glad that by chance, the one item I want to talk about is clay, since we just heard these great discussion about working with clay and sharing clay. So these are majmars, and they are sometimes the only handmade object in houses, and they are often made by the women who live in the houses. And so this is rolled clay. So clay that is pulled out into rolls and then circled around and then shaped. So the item in the one on the left is frankincense, which is from cutting frankincense trees. And that little tea light in front is just to show you size, just to give you a perception of size. So the one on the left are the sort of standard kind, and the one on the right are the ones that are usually used. And you can see how there's a lot more sort of work put into it in terms of the shape, and then work put into it in terms of the decoration. So you've got crystals and you have colors and you have all of these things to make it shiny and bright. And you take a charcoal briquette, not the kind used for barbecue, but one that is smokeless and odorless. Heat it with a lighter, put it at the bottom of that, put a piece of frankincense on top, and you get these enormous wafts of cloudy, really heavily perfumed smoke. And you walk around the house with it in the morning at sunrise and sometimes at sunset to sort of clear the air. And this is a traditional craft, and it's attested in prehistoric times as being used with frankincense, and is one of the symbols of the Dhofar region. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll move right into our next presentation.
Let me share my documents. I'm not sure if you can see it. Please let me know.
Not yet. Oh, there it is.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. From a cloudy afternoon in Istanbul, Turkey. I'm going to talk about, let me set my timer, first of all. I'm going to talk about crafting at and of home during COVID-19 in Turkey, craft making as homemaking. This work is based on a research addressing the meaning of home during the COVID-19 pandemic by demonstrating gender-based experiences of staying at home. It's based on online qualitative semi-structured interviews conducted with 33 female and 5 male participants living in Turkey between the ages of 18 and 63. Interviews were conducted between June and September 2021. And due to ongoing pandemic restrictions, all interviews were conducted by video conferencing. The participants were asked several questions about subject and meaning of home before and during the pandemic, paid and care work responsibilities, stay-at-home experiences, including work, study, life balance, spatial strategies, recreation, and family relations. When it comes to Turkish context, similar to worldwide experience, stay-at-home requirements were the first and among the most enduring measures implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic in Turkey. Soon after the first diagnosed case, on 11th of March 2020 in Turkey, public health measures were immediately taken by the government. Numerous curfews, remote education, and remote working were applied as part of the public health measures. These policies were supported by the Ministry of Health using the hashtags Evde kal, meaning stay at home, and Hayat Eve sığar, meaning life fits into home. The latter became the name of the mobile app introduced by the Ministry of Health to provide access to health services and guidance about the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, home became an all-encompassing place during the lockdowns for not only isolation, but also for work, education, and entertainment. The research question and the findings were discussed in line with three theoretical directions, which are feminist geography, homemaking, and craft making. Doreen Massey's joint conceptualizations of spatiality and identity for understanding space and place in general, and home in particular, not as an absolute, but as a relational place, constituted the first theoretical direction. As for the second direction of theory, Iris Myron Young's conceptualization of homemaking was taken as methodologically significant for understanding experiences of staying at home. Homemaking, according to Young, involves caretaking and preservation. Caretaking refers to housework, and preservation consists of creating a meaningful narrative and identity for the household by taking care of keepsakes or memories. Like doing housework, preservation also often falls to women and is taken as part of domesticity. Homemaking is not seen as a future-oriented, productive, creative activity, but rather as seen as unvaluable as a feminine practice. Thus, in return, women can find no similar effort from others to support their identities. Regarding the theoretical perspective about craft making, the distinction between craft making as a domestic and feminized activity and craft making as a productive activity explains the gender feature of craft making as homemaking. Given that repeated lockdowns have encouraged people to turn to crafts of various kinds and for numerous reasons, experiences of craft making are expected to help to understand homemaking from gender perspective. As for the hobbies and crafts, in the context of this research, the participants in this research were engaged in hobbies and crafts. For example, yoga, meditation and sports, handicraft and sewing, painting, gardening, playing instruments, and also doing ceramics, doing puzzle, small-scale renovations and decorations of home. And their motivations were including the need to cope with the stress, group interaction, leisure time, physical health, and resilience. And loosening of time pressure was an overall determinant in terms of having the motivation for engaging with hobbies or craft making. Except group interaction, which was actually related with pre-pandemic periods, because during the pandemic, it was rather related with isolation. The motivations included, as you are going to see on the screen, with some examples from in the quotations, were including to cope with the stress. For example, one of the participants, Parla, who engaged in jewelry making, painting, and ceramics during the lockdowns, was explaining her motivation with the need to cope with the stress. And spending time or overcoming the immobility inside the home were among the motivations. And finally, as exemplified by another quotation here, Feriha, one of the participants who started sewing and wooden print, suggested that learning crafts changed her attitude for learning in general, that contributed to her capacity of resilience. As I just mentioned, loosening of time pressure was an overall determinant. Compared to daily hassle of the pre-pandemic period, lockdowns during the pandemic broke down the strict control over time, which was a matter of freedom for the participants. A time use survey conducted in Australia shows a similar result, that despite the increased time spent on housework, especially by women, participants reported loosening of subjective time pressure and feelings of slower pace of time. This was similar in my research. When participants' experiences are taken together, hobbies and crafts don't fall into category of homemaking as housework. Nevertheless, these experiences are connected to homemaking as preservation, as an activity of meaning making and identity construction. It's not a fixed but an ongoing effort for writing and rewriting a narration about what brought oneself here. During lockdowns, when subjective perception of time expanded, the participants could turn their attention inwards and created an opportunity for self-reflection. When findings are discussed in line with theoretical directions, three results arise parallel with the three theoretical directions. First of all, the lived experiences of the participants revealed that the meaning of home during the lockdowns has changed in different ways. It seemed that the experiences of homemaking sustained the gendered nature of homemaking as housework, especially for married couples with children. It was because of the increased amount of household chores due to the lack of outsourcing, school closures, and it was combined with conventional gender division of domestic labor. Therefore, this study supported the existing research about gender-specific organization of care work and time usage before and during the pandemic. It is, given that home is a relational place, it is seen that doing and undoing gender identities, norms and relationships, and performances are intertwined with homemaking and undoing of home. This was particularly true for women living in one-person households or for cohabiting couples without children. Their experiences with their homes before pandemic revealed a little identification with home and rejection of homemaking practices. Since their identification was with their work and since they had no dependent household members to take care of, they could easily remain outside the heteropatriarchal norms of homemaking. Negation of the maintenance of the housework includes rejection of home as a source of preservation, as the source of individual identity and personal narrative. However, it is seen in this research that during the pandemic, undoing home is replaced by homemaking in terms of preservation, which included craft making. This study supported that not only homemaking in terms of caretaking, but also efforts to create a meaning out of personal experiences were predominantly gendered and involved in the experiences of the participants. The participants in this research interpreted their personal histories in the light of experiences of staying at home during several lockdowns. I already said that craft making is seen feminine and not productive. It falls in the category of homemaking as preservation for similar reasons. This study shows the gender-based experiences of craft making as linked to the meaning of home and shows the need to reevaluate and ungender homemaking, not only in terms of caretaking, but also preservation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to move into our last presentation. Do we have our presenter on screen?
I'm here.
There you are. Okay, we'll get started when you're ready.
Oh, right. I'm sort of aware that I'm standing between you and lunch. So let me share my screen here. And I wanted to also thank you for having me. I appreciate the outreach to the virtual community as well as the local community that you have there as well. And in a way, I think my talk is going to kind of maybe navigate between the two talks that we have just heard. So I always appreciate interdisciplinarity in a conference, but I'm going to abide by my disciplinary conventions and also read my talk in the interest of staying on time. But hopefully we will get through this in an engaging way that doesn't feel too much like you're being read to. To our last panel presentation, thinking about gender. You know, homemaking has long been gendered as a feminine dwelling practice, whereas home design has often been attributed to the realm of masculine public sphere activity. And when trying to imagine new forms for homes, male architects and designers and other home professionals have been surprised to find their innovating intentions for remaking domestic space thwarted by female residents who persisted in making homes through spatial appropriation techniques that hampered implementation of planners' agendas. When professional, often male, expertise has been come into conflict with resident expertise, often female, these professionals malign certain domestic practices as traditional or backward or the primary cause of failures. And while the gendering has become less acute over time, the clash of home expertise persists. And so I'm looking at craft also in this sense of expertise. And in this talk, I'll use two case studies of publicly funded French housing to briefly examine two different historical moments, the 1950s and the 2010s, where home professionals' proposals to create new ways of dwelling via domestic space have conflicted with common dwelling practices. And so we'll ask whose craft matters more. France is a highly centralized state, one that since the end of World War II takes its cultural or civilizing mission very seriously. The French believe in an art of living that prioritizes the quality of everyday life. And so in 1945, when the French needed to combat both a severe housing shortage as well as to regain a place on the world stage after the quick defeat in 1940 in collaboration with the Nazis, they looked to mass housing as a way to affordably deliver a comfortable but beautiful modernity. The policies of a newly created housing ministry at the time led to the 4P, a subsidized public housing apartment in a high-rise, high-density complex. And so there are three examples on the screen of different sorts of 4P, 4 pièces, most of which featured a balcony, a loggia of some kind, long picture windows, and a lab kitchen that was designed to minimize steps and the housewife's exertion, along with central heating and hot water for everyone in the complex. And so by designing spaces that would facilitate household labor and provide rest and comfort to a large segment of the population, architects and planners felt that they were helping to modernize France. And by the end of the 1950s, the French saw large-scale housing projects like Eau de Lièvre, this is in Nancy, This is a long strip that houses 3,500 families. And these grands ensembles, these projects began to dominate the landscape. So in recognition of the novelty of this sort of housing solution for a nation accustomed to kind of bungalow or single family detached dwelling or low-rise apartment buildings, in 1959, the construction ministry sponsored surveys and focus groups and resident studies. And these studies revealed that women, while they were by and large very satisfied with a number of the aspects of their new homes, they also had some complaints. With their referendum apartment, which debuted at something called the Domestic Arts Expo, which was attended by hundreds of thousands of people, up to 1 million every year, the women clamored for, among other tweaks, hallways that we saw in the first presentation, eat-in kitchens, and regular-sized windows that they could sew or buy curtains for. And so they debuted their plan for a referendum apartment, a referendum on the current style of housing in 1959. So you can see that the hallway and such there. The design community's reaction to the referendum apartment were harsh. One publication observed, "The respect that we owe these women, all belonging to very reputable family associations, should not prevent us from writing that we have rarely seen within the walls of the expo a more banal and backward presentation." Lionel Shine, who was the architect of the futuristic plastic house, celebrated the 1956 expo. This is how he wanted us to live, objected, "We condemn the fake chaste education engendered by a deceptive lifestyles, slipcovers, house slippers, parlor, corridors, decorative facades, and shutters. How will a child evolve in such an environment? Have the mothers even thought of that? They haven't even thought of themselves. The problem of the kitchen, the dining area, and the living room has been deeply analyzed at length for over 40 years by those who have been fascinated from day one by the response of interior design to new modes of living. Most women living in the new housing units just wanted to serve their family meals in the kitchen. Not only did they have to travel less distance to prepare the table, but keeping food out of the living room allowed this space to remain tidy longer. So in this sense, their preference to dine in the kitchen was entirely compatible with one of the fundamental goals of modern housing, which was to reduce household labor. Yet the preference for eat-in kitchens conflicted with a key modernist design principle, that of separation of functions. Having identified the kitchen as a lab for meal preparation, architects found it difficult to countenance its multiple usage. Architect Georges-Henri Pingusson justified the spatial tyranny of the lab kitchen. He said it's the exact opposite of the peasant kitchen, the hearth around which the family gathers, where you have the radio and the laundry drying. This is a way of being together, but in a place where you shouldn't be. I consider the trend of combining the kitchen and the living dining area to be a fleeting one. It's a backward step for the art of dwelling and a social decline. However, despite designers' objections, the housing ministry, eager to win acceptance of these new forms of housing, ultimately began to plan for eat-in kitchens and standard-sized windows in the new forms of social housing. So the users won throughout the late 60s and early 70s. Facing a new crisis 50 years later, this time one of climate change, in 2009, the state turned to Eco-Quartier. The French Ministries of Housing and Territory inaugurated the Eco-Neighborhood Program to meet explicit priorities of reducing an area's carbon footprint, spurring urban renewal and economic development, and improving residents' daily lives through sustainable living. The award-winning Eco-Quartier that I study feature a combination of rainwater capture systems, solar panels, airtight or passive heating systems, green living exterior walls, and shutters or blinds of some kind to minimize sun exposure in the summer, thereby needing less cooling. While the program aims to improve inhabitant well-being, the goal of energy conservation is still the Eco-Quartier's endgame. This can considerably constrain inhabitants' freedom and autonomy, however. Take, for instance, the competing understandings of the roles of sunlight and fresh air for residents and designers. a number of complexes encourage inhabitants to keep blinds or shutters closed in the summer, open all day in the winter, or at even more specific times of day, given the building's orientation. Residents, however, prefer to throw the windows and blinds open while cleaning and cooking to air out their apartments, even if these actions take place during a time of day when both should be shut for thermal efficiency. Airing out as a dwelling practice contributes to residents' estimation of order and cleanliness, even as engineers counter that their ventilation systems produce filtered, purified air that was, technically speaking, cleaner than so-called fresh air from the exterior. At a building in Paris, management regretted the failure of residents to keep their thermostats set to recommended temperatures. The building's representative noted with frustrations that residents acted this way despite the postings and preventative measures supplied in the buildings. And we can see some of the, even with the images, you can, without the translation, you can see the recommendations there. In Grenoble, management discovered that residents bothered by the colder temperatures simply purchased space heaters and thereby driving up the building's electricity expenditure. I'm going to conclude in a moment because I know you have lunch, but a second example is just that of living walls. We see that climbing ivy to help add to the cooling aspect of the building facades. Residents found that this brought things like slugs and insects and spiders into their homes. They did not want this. So they simply trimmed the ivy away. And as anthropologist Mary Douglas has observed, things such as insects or noxious smells from cooking are intrusions. They are things out of order. Cleaning is a way of safeguarding order and bolstering one's security. So eco-neighborhood residents feel justified in subverting the climatic effects of green walls or passive ventilation systems and closed shutters within the space of their homes. So in conclusion, while the premise of the eco-quartier as a vector for modifying residential practices and values suggests that France's faith in spatial determinism has remained strong since the 1950s, the twin cultural norms of comfort and autonomy attached to the home limit the efficacy of new forms of domestic space being used as privileged drivers of behavioral change. We see housing professionals' crusades falter upon residents' dwelling practices, the necessary means by which homes are made via both decor and homemaking, housekeeping. Residents' expertise will triumph, and therefore home designers and engineers and planners have to incorporate more sociological, anthropological, and crafters' understanding of dwelling if they wish to use housing to craft culture. And I will stop there.
Thank you, and thank you to all the presenters for bringing such rich ideas into this space. And I'm especially impressed with how you were able to do that within such a short time, within such time constraints. So we are almost out of time. We're going to extend our session by a few minutes so that we have an opportunity to field some questions from the audience. And so I'll be taking questions online and in person here. And for those of you who would like to ask a question in person, we have a microphone set up that's just here in front of me. So you can feel free to come up to the mic and ask your question. And for those of you that are online, feel free to ask your question in the chat. Any takers? These presentations have certainly given me a lot to think about in terms of how the meanings and functions of home are made in relation, I guess, to craft and vice versa. I'm wondering if any of the speakers have any comments on that.
I think there's a comment in the chat as well.
Oh, are they coming in? Okay, feel free to just write your comment in the chat and I can read it out so that our in-person audience can also hear the question.
Hi, I just wanted to comment. Well, it was really nice to listen to the three of you, and I was very impressed with some similarities. I am from Mexico and I live in a city called Puebla, but I grew up in Mexico City, and there are similarities in the way some objects are used, especially the ones that Mirielle presented, those things where you can put the charcoal and the thing, we call it copal here, and we call it saumerios. And we use it during the Day of the Dead, which is the All Saints, and the Dia de los Muertos is very special here. And we put it on the altars that we make on the Day of the Dead. I don't know if you have heard of that. It's a very, very interesting tradition that is part of the house making and the craft making tradition in Mexico. So I was really surprised to know that it is used all the way there. But in a way, since we have Spanish tradition that was brought with the conquest in the 16th century, and the Arabs were in Spain for so long, I think there's a lot of intertwining traditions that are brought to us in Mexico. So I just wanted to mention that. And also I was very impressed with Nicole's presentation as to how the experts tell us how we should live, as opposed to how we actually, the people live and how we use our houses, and especially women, no? How, why is not important our opinion? And so not just that, and it was really enjoyable, the three of the presentations, and also how the craft was used during pandemics to make us feel better. I was talking yesterday about my piece, which is a pandemic quilt, that came as a result of a workshop I offered to a group of mothers that were so tired and stressed out because their routine had changed so much at home. And so thank you very much for your three presentations.
Thank you for that question. Would any of our presenters like to respond to it? We have a few minutes left to take some quick comments from you, if you'd like to respond. Oh, I think your mic is off.
Where I live in Dhofar is one of the few places on earth where the frankincense trees grow, and the use of frankincense is attested in prehistoric finds. And one of the issues of living in these concrete houses is that there's no fire detectors. And so you can have these enormous clouds of smoke going through your rooms twice every day, which would set off any kind of fire alarm. So the good news is you get a great smell, and the bad news, it's a total fire hazard. But
one of the things that I just wanted to think about with everyone in terms of craft and the ways in which bodies in space, in the space of the home, are considered also a sort of crafting, right? My historical actors of architects and designers, they would look at Mirielle's floor plan that she showed us and think that it was tremendously old-fashioned, that because you are repeating this notion of the parlor versus the intimates of the family, which is for the modernist architects like hopelessly bourgeois of trying to make this social claim, right? And yet there are practitioners of homemaking who are like, no, that you can keep the majlis, if I pronounce that correctly, clean and tidy and always ready to receive people, whereas the living space of the intimates can be a little bit more chaotic. And you have this clash over how you're going to craft home via its inhabitants. And there are kinds of using the inhabitants of the home in the way that we craft other parts of the other aspects in the domestic space in the home.
Yeah, and one issue that comes up a lot is that I have people who don't know the Arab world or the Arabian Peninsula or Oman explain to me how women aren't at home in their own homes, having never been in an Omani home or knowing Omani women. And I think that's really interesting about how women craft the space, because they consider the entire home as theirs. And outsiders often say the modulus is the space only for men, which is not true at all. So I think that's very important. And the talk about what people did during the pandemic and this idea of women's space and women's work in the home, in talking about the Arab world, it's so much put upon, like, oh, the modulus must be just for men, and that's actually not true. So I think that's a very interesting comment about how women craft or are conceived to have crafted their own home space.
I just want to acknowledge the fact they're taking the tables away from me. So I think that is a signal that we're about to wrap up. But I'd like to just invite our last speaker to provide maybe a quick final comment if you'd like to.
Yeah, thank you. I might add a few words to comments made by Nicole and Mirielle. Actually, this is one of the findings that I witnessed in my research. One of the participants was saying that it was very difficult to have your father, the man, around during the COVID-19 lockdowns, because when they're around, you have to make it in order. Everything should be clean, ready. It's based on daily schedule. So crafting, homemaking in terms of crafting home also is very gendered in that sense. I just wanted to add this, and I don't want to, take your time that much more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your contributions to this conference are very much appreciated by all of us, and we'd love to keep this conversation going, but we are overdue for lunch, and we have hungry people in the room. I can see that they're getting worked up, so thank you once again for participating in the conference. And with that, we'll convene this session, and we will head to lunch, I believe. Thank you.
It's polite to say Kwe when you meet another First Nations person. Myself, I'm Denende. I come from the Northwest Territories. My dad taught me how to hunt and fish because we're 3 girls, and I ended up being his son. I shot my first moose. I was 23 years old. My grandmother was really upset because apparently I scared the moose. So yeah, my Dene name is Yakeda, which means big eyes. And I learned to cook from this cookbook. It's called the Northern Cookbook. It was made by the Indian Affairs in the 1970s. It's pretty much the only cookbook that took Arctic ingredients and used basic ingredients that we had up north. In the north, we use a lot of, we hunt a lot to subsidize for meat and food because the grocery stores are extremely expensive. The last time I went to the Northwest Territories, a tomato in the middle of the summer was $8. I know the prices here are going up, but $8 for a tomato is pretty crazy. So what I did is I garden. So in the Northwest Territories, the sun sets in the summer never. It's still up at midnight. My parents had lots of trouble putting us to sleep as kids, but in that way, we could almost do 2 gardens in one summer. I am a terrible green thumb. My grandmother laughed her head off because I had like made a celery bush, but I put like 14 little grains in the same one. So my celery was this big. So today you're gonna taste some celery, and I find like celery goes really well with meat. And today I made you some rabbit. I have a story. I always talk about my grandmother, but she passed not too long ago, and she's the one that really taught me my traditions. And she also like, I'm getting a little, but she also told me I was a really good cook. And it's not in the food that like, but sometimes like, as an early 20s person, I went to Concordia here. I had trouble finding myself. I was Indigenous, I'm half Quebecois, so I really didn't know where my place was. I would often go back to the Northwest Territories. I travel a lot around Canada, and I was received into a lot of First Nations communities. I worked on housing projects, and that's how I learned how to cook different bannocks and different breads and different means of appropriating Indigenous cuisine. So that's why I'm an expert. But it was just like my grandmother saying, like, you're a really good cook. And like that stayed with me because she said I wasn't a very good hunter, but yeah, so like you do what you love. And I love hosting. I love cooking. And today I made, sorry, I think I'm getting my period. But j'ai fait du lièvre. I made some rabbit. My grandmother taught me how to snare rabbits when I was 4 years old. So that was my means of helping my family. I also am really good with a gun, and that was the first thing my dad told my husband when he talked to him. So the rabbit I made with lemon, pine nuts, and it's a little sweet, and there's lots of vegetables. There's some acorn squash. I really like using the ingredients: acorn squash, strawberries, corn, and what is the other one? Haricot beans, because we're on Mohawk land, and this is part of the Three Sisters. So I introduced that into a little ragu for all the vegetarians. It's with aubergine and beans, but I know aubergines aren't indigenous, but I'm colonizing them today. And there's a little couscous to go with the meats, and then there's a vegetable. I made a celeriac puree with some maple carrots, and then there's a cherry balsamic reduction there. And then I made like a little pesto butter to go with my bannock. Apparently my bannock is the best in the world, says my 3-year-old daughter who made it this morning. And then there's a little carrot salad. So I like to be kind to vegans. So this is for you. There's a cheese platter there with some olive tapenade. And then I made a strawberry drink. Please don't ask me what I put in it. It's a secret, but I put sweetgrass. So enjoy. I invite you to come up and then serve yourself your meal. That way you can take what you like. Oh yes, and also very important. In this book, there's something called Charlie's Pudding. It's the first recipe I ever did in my life. I made it last night with my children. So it's Aude is preparing it for you guys. Bon appétit. Merci. Also, my elastic broke, so my hair is like. If you have any other questions, I don't cry all the time. Masicho. Masicho is thank you in my Dene language. It was taken from the priests. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for joining us for the afternoon, and please excuse the tinkling of cutlery. There will be a little bit more of that at some different points throughout the afternoon. We're just tidying up from our lunch and coffee. For those of you who would like some coffee, or I believe there's a little bit more Charlie's pudding with maple left over. It's actually on the other side of the screen. So there's coffee, There's some of the mocktail that Swaneige made for us, which is delicious, and I really recommend you try it, and a little bit of dessert. So you can kind of go around behind the screen and it's just right there. You're welcome to help yourself. And so we'll get started with the first panel of the afternoon, and I'll hand the mic over to Juliet, our chair.
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me well? So thanks for joining us. I feel kind of lucky to be hosting in the afternoon. I mean, everyone's gotten some good food over the lunch. And so today's panel is titled Mapping Ecologies of Home. And so our panelists today, we have a hybrid mode of presentation, so online and in person. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panelists. First, we have Kathleen Vaughan, who's a place-based artist researcher of social and environmental projects related to the dynamic ecosystems of rivers, forests, and skies. Her own practice now emphasizes textiles both to explore diverse cultural and industrial histories and to create art that can eventually, quote unquote, rot, subside into the earth with limited environmental footprint. Next, also with us today is Michelle Wilson. She is an artist and mother, currently residing as an uninvited guest on the Treaty 6 territory in London, Ontario. In the Euro-American archive, the bodies of other animals are used to convey colonial knowledge systems. Their stories of survival are used to perpetuate myths of quote-unquote settler saviors. As a feminist of settler descent studying in colonial institutions, this is the legacy that Wilson has inherited and is confronting in her research-based intermedia practice. She earned a PhD in art and visual culture from the University of Western Ontario and is currently a postdoctoral scholar with the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership at the University of Guelph. And online, we have with us Magdalena Buchczyk, who is an anthropologist and junior professor in social anthropology of cultural expressions at the Humboldt-Universität Berlin. Her research focuses on material culture, heritage, and knowledge production with ethnographic research on collections, making, and learning. Buchczyk's monograph, Weaving Europe, Crafting the Museum, will be published with the Bloomsbury Academic in 2023. And last but not least, we have also online with us Ilga Leimanis, who is a Montreal-born visual artist, educator, researcher, and author based in London, UK. For nearly 15 years, Ilga's practice-led pedagogy has brought her into contact with many diverse groups of students, both in the UK and internationally. Ilga founded Drawn in London, which is an urban sketching group, and wrote her first book, Sketching Perspective, in 2021. So first up is Kathleen's presentation. So I'll just set that up. Oh.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And nice to see you here, and people online as well. This afternoon, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the River's Threads, Au Fil du Saint-Laurent, the community stitch project that those of you who are here in Montreal might have seen taking place by the windows in the fourth space through this week. Using cyanotype, eco-printing, and natural dye, my team of grad student artist RAs and I have created the ground into which we invite anyone to stitch. This piece provides an opportunity to sit for as little or as long as one likes, converse or not, and embroider either motifs or words already sketched in that relate to the river life or to free-form elements of their own choosing. We're inaugurating the piece here at the Homemaking Conference, and in June we'll set the work up again alongside the St. Lawrence in collaboration with the Borough of Verdun. The river's threads include cyanotypes and eco-prints of plants harvested along the St. Lawrence River's edge in Verdun, one place in the city that the shoreline is actually accessible. People from here will know that it's not accessible everywhere. It also includes, in the finishing and edging work to come, pieced lengths of naturally dyed linen and cotton colored with local plants. These samples and the display, which is in this space as well, were created for the project by artist and RA Jen Moisson. She and my other graduate student assistants / collaborators are an essential part of this piece, as are and will be all those people whose stitches and stories contribute to the final work of collaborative research creation. This is a mock-up of what we're working towards, a multi-panel textile work that will be mounted on linen and include a pieced border of our naturally dyed cloth. I'll explain how this work came to be configured in this way and what it has to do with questions of both home and craft. But first, I'll outline the larger research initiative of which this is a part. The River's Threads is part of my SSHRC-funded interdisciplinary Learning with the St. Lawrence, Apprendre avec le Saint-Laurent project. Learning with the St. Lawrence is now in its 5th and final year of bringing together artists, environmental scientists, St. Lawrence River stakeholders of all kinds, and members of the general public in an investigation of our attitudes to and hopes for this exceptional waterway, the 3rd largest river in Canada. We've been using art making, storytelling style interviews, and public outreach to collect data that assembles into a multi-mode story about our beautiful river. This initiative, like almost all my work, is what I call place-based, as per our introduction, meaning that I use the work to dig deeply into complex and interlaced questions relating to cultural and natural histories, ecosystems, geologies and deep time, urban development and social justice, indigenous orientations and epistemologies, personal and hyperlocal connections, and possible futures. As an artist, I work with multiple media, usually in some kind of juxtaposition that I consider a version of collage, since I'm interested in what happens when you bring things together. I'm always keen on exploring how different art forms, voices, techniques, and visual approaches bounce off, resonate with, and contribute to each other in terms of the work's reception in the world. I am increasingly conscious of and working to reduce the environmental impact of the material choices of my art making, whether said materials are part of the work's foreground, like the cloth and thread, or exist in the background, as my computer and digital camera do. I need to recenter the planet and its ecosystems in my understandings of place. I have long used the term place, drawing on the work of late feminist geographer Doreen Massey, who suggested that place can be seen as open, a global sense of place, as woven together out of ongoing stories, a moment within power geometries, as a particular constellation within the wider topographies of space, as in process, as unfinished business. While I like this understanding of place as a complex process, I find it a little, if you'll pardon the term, ungrounded. And so I look to art writer Lucy Lippard's understanding of land, which is as lines and circles of thought about the interlocking histories, unacknowledged class systems, racial, gender, and cultural divisions and common grounds, not to mention the possibility of past lives, all of which define our relationships to places and help explain the lure of the local. I appreciate Lippard's added specificity and that both she and Doreen Massey are oriented to inclusivity, to relationality. The sense of relationality was integral to my own understanding of that very particular form of place we call home, I have been working on the idea of home for more than 15 years, wondering how it is that a person can develop a feeling of being at home in the world and developing studio and community-based projects that explore the role of art making in this same process. Through the art making and research of my PhD dissertation, in 2007, I came up with a definition of home that worked well for me at the time. I considered that home is an ever-shifting standpoint from which to learn, grow, understand oneself, relate to each other, and to contribute to communal life. While I stand by this description, from the perspective of my thinking today, I find it, like Lepard's and Massey's, too human-centric. Where is the concern for the natural world, the sense of responsibility to creatures and processes that are not human? With our planet in environmental crisis, I feel an imperative to understand place-based connection that isn't only human-centric. And I need to be developing that understanding, excuse me, using art materials with low environmental impact. Why would I be making work that would damage my home? For the past 15 years, the home where I reside has been the city where I was born, Montreal. For more than 20 years, I lived in Toronto and worked to develop a sense of home there. Living here now, I am inspired by the dynamic ecosystem of the St. Lawrence River, the liminal spaces of the changeable shoreline and water levels, the species that live alongside, within, and above the river. And I am particularly interested in the river in winter, as you can see in this photograph along the shoreline in Verdun. With this collaborative stitching project in mind, through this past late winter and into the spring, I collected many plant species from along the river in Verdun, planning to use them in the work. I considered that one way to decenter the humans and recenter the other than humans was to give the mark-making agency to the plants. Their bodies, either via resist on cyanotype, it's very blurry, sorry, or in an imprint via eco-printing, directly create forms on cotton and linen, some prepared with natural dyes. These are all processes with very low toxicity, and the natural fibers would, over time, biodegrade without residue. As I say, I want my work to be able to rot someday, not right away. I realized that as we worked, that the outcomes of these printing and dyeing experiments were very directly affected by the specific chemistry of this place. Its water, which is of course the river's water, and the plant matter we had collected, as well as the mordants with which we prepared the cloth. I remembered back to a story that Gudrun Bjarnadottir, a natural dyer in Iceland, had told about needing to go back to the house she had recently moved from to collect its water to use in her dye bath in order to recreate the color she had achieved when she lived there. The water in her current home in a different community couldn't reproduce the same color, even with the same plants. And it occurred to me that as I was doing this work of homemaking with respect to the river, what I was engaging with was perhaps not place, not land, but with what foodies call terroir. Terroir is, as Stephen Erlanger has written, a concept almost untranslatable, combining soil, weather, region, and notions of authenticity, of genuineness and particularity, of roots and home, in contrast to globalized products trying to taste the same everywhere. Terroir at least integrates a sense of the other than human world, even if the term has become somewhat co-opted for marketing products rather than used in the service of conservation and respect for biodiversity, at least so far. Our own terroir was created through the interaction of the print and dye processes and chemistries together, sieved through our own imaginations, aesthetics, and intentions. My great team and I layered our plant-based imagery into a kind of patchwork, assembled multiple cloths together in a single work, and anticipated the embroidery that we would invite people to add by penciling in images and words, specifically silhouettes and names of local plants, animal, birds, and insects in English, French, and Mohawk. Those who embroidered with us would be invited to use these or to add elements of their own choosing to freeform if they wished. You might well ask why, if I want to center the other than human world in this work, am I inviting human intervention in the form of embroidery? Why bring in this art and craft practice? I do so in part because embroidery is usually a slow process, one that can be very simple if one wishes, and therefore not so taxing that one can't simultaneously converse with a neighbor who happens also to be stitching. Of course, through working side by side with our hands and materials, we share techniques, we tell stories, we learn about ourselves and each other, and of course, we also consider the subject matter of the work that we're co-developing, the St. Lawrence River. These days, many of us are coming to value slow processes, activities that allow us to disengage from the fast production and consumption we normally experience, that valorize materials and how they are sourced. More of us are coming around to the ideas espoused by writer Elaine Lipson in her 2012 Slow Cloth Manifesto. This lovely text offers a conversation about process and practice, sustainability and skill, beauty and expression. Among other meaningful contributions, Lipson's manifesto reminds us that making things that take attention and care is not a waste of time, it's reclaiming time. We can choose materials and methods for the pleasure of using them and for their appropriateness to our design, not for speed, efficiency, sameness, or short-lived trendiness. Such an approach values an orientation to process and to craft in ways that might resonate with evolving and contemporary understandings of home, place, and land, of coming to know a place and earning a sense of home there. Anishinaabe musician and writer Leanne Betamasek-Simpson reminds us that in her culture, the land, Aki, is both context and process. The process of coming to know is learner-led and profoundly spiritual in nature. Coming to know is the pursuit of whole body intelligence practiced in the context of freedom. And when realized collectively, it generates generations of loving, creative, innovative, self-determining, interdependent, and self-regulating community-minded individuals. That's what the university should be doing too. It creates communities of individuals with the capacity to upload and move forward our political traditions and systems of governance. This ethic inspires me as a non-Indigenous person without such land-based cultural values of my own. As an uninvited settler on unceded Indigenous land, I respect this approach very much and recognize how much I and we might learn from it. I'm trying to do so through a terroir-imbued collaborative textile practice with projects such as the River's Threads. Through these, I'm aiming to craft a new definition of home that is more mindful of other than humans. And so our work continues. The River's Threads, Au fil du Saint-Laurent, is made possible by the many contributions of team members Jen Moissan, Jackie Lowe, Emily O'Brien, and Sharmish Dakar, some of whom are here today, by funding from the Social Scientists and Humanities Research Council of Canada, by the beauty and fragility of the St. Lawrence River. Thank you.
All right, next up is Michelle. So I'll pull up your presentation.
That was a lot to follow. That was amazing. It was wonderful.
Oh, I'm not sure how to. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sharing. Just
in here.
use that, yeah.
Sorry, one moment. Yeah, I always forget that step. Okay. There. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Yes, my name is Michelle Wilson. I'm so happy and honored to be here. I currently reside as an uninvited guest on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Attawandaron, and Huron-Wendat peoples in what is now known as London, Ontario. My ancestors came from England and Brittany, and for the past few generations have settled around Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal. Today, I'm here representing the Coves Collective, which is an ad hoc group of artists, educators, and activists that have come together to attend to our responsibilities and relationships with the Coves, an environmentally significant area in the middle of London, Ontario. The Coves Collective is founded on an ethos of direct action, accessibility, collaboration, and justice. We are rooted in the local and together engage the vexed and contradictory histories and futures of place. Our work reveals how the Coves, environmentally significant area, is simultaneously a beloved community destination, a rich biodiverse habitat, a site of environmental degradation, and a space of resistance, imagination, and bold ecological visioning. Grounded in an Indigenous pedagogy and epistemology, the Coves Collective is building a matrix of healthy relationships founded on reciprocity and gratitude. The actions of this collective include Tracing Careful Paths, which is a community-produced textile map. It's on display right over here. You can see it later. It'll also be in the presentation. I produced that with collaborator Riley Knowles. We also had SOS, a living phytoremediation artwork by Paul Chartrand, on the land teachings, including traditional medicine gathering and medicine pouch making, led by cultural justice coordinator Candice Dube, carp fishing with Brad Isaacs, and clay harvesting and vessel making guided by ceramicist Shauna Red Sky. And that was all our first year. And we're beginning our second year of place-based actions and learning with new and returning artists and community collaborators. So the majority of the Coves Collective participants, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are guests on the land that we call home. And so in this presentation, I would like to tell you some stories about the land that we call the Coves, how we're endeavoring to be good guests in this place, and how we actively question and engage in the process of belonging. On this map, Tracing Careful Paths, we, the Coves Collective, illustrate the land we traced with our bodies during walks and workshops and recorded with GPS apps. And you can see that in the white on white, like running stitches. In community stitching circles, we created images with threads stained and dyed with plants from this place. Soils with long memories nourished these plant beings. These soils remember the relationships that played out across their surfaces, the toxins that leached down or were born through groundwater, and the bullets and chemical tanks embedded in their depths. Before human memory, a retreating glacier formed the river known to its Anishinaabe stewards as the Deshkon-Zibi, or Antler River. Later, some of the Deshkon-Zibi's flow split off from its mother, seeking a path of least resistance, formed an oxbow meander, creating what is now an island of land nestled in the crook of a horseshoe of muddy ponds. Settlers had yet to sever the meander from its mother when the Deshkon-Zibi and Anishinaabe signed McKee Treaty No. 2 and London Township Treaty No. 6. And as deceitful as those treaties were, written in the barely decipherable legalese of land transfer, and only vaguely resembling the minutes and memories from the negotiations they emerged from, one thing is clear: The Deshkun-Ziebig and Anishinaabeg never surrendered their rights and responsibilities to their traditional land, which London, Ontario now occupies, and never ceded title to the bed of the Deshkun-Ziebig. And just a note on names, the Deshkun-Ziebig and Anishinaabeg are commonly known to settlers as the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, and colonizers first called the Deshkun-Ziebig Le Tranché, but most recently, Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe called it the Thames River. So following the pond's banks today, we have found that only one trickling finger stretches back towards the Deshkun-Ziebig. The severing of the Deshkun-Ziebig and the meander began over a century ago when railway embankments blocked the river inflow. Still, we understand this place, known as the Coves, as part of the watershed that the Deshkun-Ziebig and Anishinaabeg nation never ceded. But what does ownership mean when we understand that this area also falls under the inherent indigenous rights of the Minisink Lenape, also known as the Munsee Delaware Nation, and the Onyotaka, also known as the United Nation of the Thames? The waters that wore away the banks that define and protect this place also mark it as a place where we can feel what should be palpable throughout this town, province, and country. We are on stolen native land. So I ask, who does this land belong to? So this answer, again, returns us to the river. In 1937, the Deshkun-Ziebig crested its banks and swamped much of London, Ontario. In response, the city instituted flood control measures that arrested the seasonal submerging of the lowlands held within the Oxbow. Thus, on the eve of the Second World War, the Canadian government offered up this land, which they had used for nearly 60 years as a rifle range and training ground for agriculture. Simultaneously, the advancing tide of German expansion forced the Wolfe family from what was then Czechoslovakia. In 1939, Henry Wolfe purchased nearly all the land we have mapped in this piece. He planted a fruit orchard, and you can see some of the small trees there, built a house, and quietly continued his centuries-old family trade, mixing paint in the basement in an old washing machine. Henry Wolfe and his family established the Almatex Paint Company within a decade, the buildings multiplying and the land smothered in concrete. The business thrived in the 40s and 50s, developing a unique plastic finish paint specifically for the Canadian contribution to the war that displaced the factory's founders. Before anyone could raise alarms about the environmental impact, it had become a significant employer in the city, and was so until it closed in 2001. Its warehouses, laboratory, and factory are gone. However, the chain link fences topped with barbed wire, cement pads, and blocks of concrete threaded with rebar remain, marking where men mixed heavy metals, solvents, and binders to make paint. Throughout the hot, dry summer months of 2022, the Coves Collective led walks through a hole in this fence to this site. We poured water gathered from the ponds onto a living artwork, a ring of goldenrod planted into a trench we cut into the cement with a circular saw. This goldenrod removes lead in the soil, one of the many invisible presences Almatex left behind. In the center of the ring, we marked our presence, and we continue to do so, by stacking rocks and chunks of concrete to form a cairn. In August, the former paint factory site is similarly ringed with 4-foot-high goldenrod, nourishing swarms of bees vibrantly, declaring that these plant beings are already working to heal this place. The Coves Collective's work humbly draws attention to what these plant beings have already begun, making a home for themselves amongst the ruins. We told those who accompanied us on our walks about Mrs. Aisha Hassan, who wrote to the city in 1971 and informed them that all the birds had left this area, driven away by the stench of noxious fumes. We told them about the paint pit that children set on fire in 1966, creating a column of smoke that rose hundreds of feet above the land they stood on. We told them about the 2 towering evergreens that were felled in 1981 when a labor strike turned violent, and the Almatex Paint Factory management replaced the trees with a giant pole topped with a CCTV camera. One day, as we were sharing these stories, 2 deer raced around the interior perimeter of the fence, circling us before escaping through a gap known only to them. One of the youths with us that day asked, "What is the opposite of traumatized?" Through mergers and acquisitions, Valspar, a subsidiary of Sherwin-Williams, now holds title to this land. Their contractors only visit the site to test the groundwater through locked, bright blue rectangular wells that dot the land. But does the land belong to them? We walked the trails made by humans and animals and picked up the small apples that still grow on the trees planted by Henry Wolfe. We talked about the kids in the 1970s who used to raid the orchard, collecting garbage bags full of apples to take home to their mothers, who baked them into pies. Someone from the factory once protected their property by shooting one of these kids in the ass with a shotgun packed with rock salt. We found a ginger cat half consumed by the resident coyotes on the path that weaves between the gnarled apple trees. A child left behind tobacco and the whispered words, "Rest in peace." As recently as the 1920s and 30s, the ponds that circle this land still flowed with some water from the Deshkanzibi. They were so clear and clean that settlers set up ice harvesting businesses on their banks. Now, the only water that flows into them is runoff from the streets and neighborhoods, kicking the natural sedimentation process into overdrive. The water has become nearly opaque in places. In the spring of 1970, almost all the fish in the East Pond died. We now know that water contaminated with xylene was carried by clay tile out to the ponds just beyond the orchard. In 1973, an environmental survey found that just over 2 million gallons of contaminated water reached what was described back then as a sewage lagoon every year. In winter, you can still see fish swarming around the warmer inflow of water where the factory's disposal system still empties into the South Pond. Today, there are thriving populations of turtles and common carp. The carp, a non-native giant in these small waterways, stir up the silt, keeping sunlight from penetrating the water and aquatic vegetation from taking root. Their large scales reflect bright sunlight as their golden heads break the surface of this low oxygen water to gulp the air. Most of these carp are too big to be prey for the herons and egrets who have returned to nest on these banks. So as the Coves Collective, we have tried to establish better relations with this land by harvesting carp. We honor their lives by eating their flesh when it's safe, tanning their hides and transforming their scales into sequins. Carp leather and scales have been worked into the Tracing Careful Paths map, marking the waterways where they call home. We do this work because we attend to this place. As we walk here, harvest clay and plants here, and attempt to enter into reciprocal relations here. Not because this place belongs to us, but rather because we, the Indigenous and non-Indigenous members of the Coves Collective, are in the process of belonging to this place. Thank you, Chimigwich, merci, Nawin. You can find the Coves Collective on Instagram to learn more about our ongoing art workshops and activism. And I've brought some almanacs that I produced with some other community engaged workshops supported by the Gardenship and Sedate Project and funded by Shirk. And I'd love to make them available to anyone who wants one today. Thank you.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I have a very quick announcement before the next speaker. If you have a bowl, the bowls belong to Swaneige. So we're going to just collect them from the audience very, very quickly so that she doesn't leave without them. Sorry about that, Juliet.
Okay, so next up is Magdalena. So Magdalena is online. Are you able to share your screen?
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. It is 8 p.m. here, so I'm in a slightly darker room. Sorry about that. Let me try to share my screen. Right, so, I mean, this we don't need. Is that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
I see that there's something wrong with the height of the slides, but I don't think we can do anything about it. But anyway, okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the conveners and the organizers for having me today and for enabling this talk to happen online. What I would like to do today is to consider the relationship between making, dwelling, and a sense of home in a changing waterscape, which increasingly becomes unhomely. And here I'm thinking with the notion of unhomely as uncanny, which Freud defined as terrifying, which leads us back to something long known to us, once familiar. This was a quote from Freud. So the original German word unheimlich, translated as uncanny, is seen as negative to heimlich, which is understood as homely and familiar. So the unheimlich, uncanny, thus dwells at the hinge of what is familiar and unfamiliar, homely and unhomely, natural and unnatural. John P. Mitchell and Caris Jade Petty have recently written about uncanny landscapes. Uncanny experiences can disrupt the propagated sense of participatory engagement with the environment. So the uncanny is linked to our experience with more than human. It's a sensorial but also temporal experience. It evokes images both of the past and the future. I came to think about the relationship between making, dwelling, landscape, uncanny landscape or waterscape through exploring historical craft objects, baskets that I was researching as part of an ethnography of collections of a Berlin museum. These baskets, you can see two, were acquired in Sardinia, the island on the Mediterranean, in 1931 by a German collector and exotica trader who regularly went on acquisition trips commissioned by a curator of Hamburg Museum of Ethnology. The museum curator had already visited the island in the 1920s and saw it as a cultural survival, or a repository of material culture that had already disappeared in ancient Egypt and other parts of the Mediterranean. So you have this kind of salvage idea. Sardinia was a place that in real time represented the pastness, right? These images were taken during the collector's visit in 1931, where we can see heritage of fishing and basket weaving. And I don't have time to talk about this today, but these are, again, these images of pastness and kind of unchanging craft, whilst at the same time in the background, you have a huge modernization project led by Mussolini's fascist agenda. So just to think about this pastness and this kind of imaginary of the past in terms of this history is also very important. Following these objects and their plant materials specifically, my research in 2021 and 22 took me to the wetlands of the Gulf of Oristano. And here you can see the image of Sardinia and the Gulf of Oristano just there. And these are the different lagoons that make up the waterscape, which I will be talking about. So this landscape is protected under the UNESCO Ramsar Convention, which is a convention that takes care or safeguards wetlands of international importance for its biodiversity. So these ones are seen as a unique habitat for specifically migratory birds moving between Europe and Africa, and numerous animal and plant species. And of course, these lagoons are extremely important for preventing coastal erosion. So the small town in which I've been doing my fieldwork since 2021 is built around one of these lagoons or salty lakes, which Italians or Sardinians call stagnos. The waterscape has been their home, nurturing the town through fishing and providing materials for local crafts. For example, basketry and even boats were made with the plants growing around the stanio. So exploring the wetlands with the fishermen and basket weavers, you start noticing how people, animal, and plants dwell in this landscape together. Moving carefully between the salty lakes, you come across rich flora, including junco or spiny rush. So some of it is here. And canna, which is this taller plant, growing around the roads, canals, and the lakesides. These plants are the key materials for the local craft of basketry. One needs to be at home with the landscape and to be attuned to the plants, as you can only collect them at particular points of the year, when the blades are of specific flexibility, not too young, but also not too hard or dry. There are many ideas about, for example, harvesting junco. So here is junco at specific phases of the moon. And the process involves walking carefully between the nesting birds and pulling just some of the blades. One maker explained that the lagoon is their garden. Collecting the material is like gardening, as it involves pruning the bits that help the plant grow better. Like mushroom hunters, the basket weavers have particular spots for their harvest and come at dawn to avoid the heat of the day. Canna, which was the tall plant, is acquired just once a year after the plant has reached the right stage. And as the basket makers pull the plant, they also allow the seeds to spread around. Yet the garden is changing. Intensive agriculture in the area leads to pollution of the water, changing its salinity, which of course affects flora and fauna. The local residents said that some parts of the stanio became unrecognizable and barren, devoid of the vegetation and fish. And of course, with the threat of climate change, more attention is paid also to coastal erosion. The less plants you've got, the more risk that the water will penetrate the land. So local authorities and environmental protection organizations wish to prevent the collection of plants to secure the ecological future of the Oristano area. And one example of recent initiatives is a foundation which tries to work out alternatives for sourcing plants from the lagoon. So here you can see the basket maker or the craftsperson is seen as a culprit for coastal erosion. And the idea is that the foundation would buy land in the village and plant junco and canna. So the basket makers would then make objects from this material within a cooperative that would be run by the local authority. The only condition would be to make a collection of more modern designs that could be sold as sustainable heritage in places like Milan or Amsterdam. Yet the basket makers very quickly rejected the idea of the cooperative, as they already had experience with co-op production run by local designers. Like many futures past, this initiative collapsed in the 1980s, leaving many out of work. So the foundation project worker said that the weavers like Gianni here were suspicious and anachronistic. They did not understand the need for sustainable future. And here I quote, "They feel there is always somebody to take their knowledge, land and stuff, to get rich with it. And they don't get the recognition of what they've done and what they are or who they are. They are always somehow afraid of sharing," unquote. A sustainable development project manager within this initiative said that the basket makers kept asking her, "Are you going to just give this design to someone in China so they can reproduce it cheaply?" So the weavers felt that the environmental project seemed to have misunderstood the very core of their own relationship between people, plants, land, and property. For them, the material could not be obtained from anywhere, like in the case of the foundation's plan to create a plantation from which material would be obtained. They also rejected privatizing this landscape and wanted to have continued access to communal marshes. They explained that the plants cannot be cultivated as everything differs depending on time, season, and position in the waterscape. The weavers dwell within this landscape, which entails, as I said, careful maneuvering of these different conditions through the act of collecting. For them, the plants are not just raw material or commodity that it's transformed into an object, but companions that might have their own character. They can be, for example, very stubborn, cooperative, or don't listen sometimes to the weaver and break down. So the idea of this project lacked this dwelling perspective, embodied knowledge, and missed how the landscape is inhabited, how it mediates the embodied ways of communicating with animals and plants. Increasingly, the makers find themselves in a very difficult position. So it's illegal to collect, but you don't want to work with the alternatives provided by environmental projects. The anthropologist Tracy Hetherington, writing on the establishment of a park in Sardinian mountains, reminds us that globally oriented environmentalisms are rooted in global dream times, rendering nature with a capital N as sacred, timeless, universal, global, and always at risk. The ecological futuring of this kind of Ramsar lagoon management is predicated on private property, decontextualized environmental protection models, an assumption that all collecting is loot. Paradoxically, environmental protection seems to be driven by a modernist logic of growth and upscaling, because they want to have these collections, which the local craftspeople don't really feel as able to provide. So at this point, I would like to return to this idea of uncanny or increasingly unhomely relationship between the lagoon residents and the landscape. As our environment is becoming very unhomely under climate change and the Anthropocene, perhaps we could reconsider what role could craft play in this context. For Richard Sennett, craft is a special condition of being engaged, productive of distinct ways of being and knowing. And the anthropologist Tim Ingold also argued that craft needs to be understood as an immersive form of practice that has a capacity to bring forth the practitioners situated within the activity. Craft is a form of dwelling. It's about ongoing temporal interweaving of our lives with another and with the manifold constituents of our environment. And just very briefly, sorry, I'm aware that I took a little bit longer. I argue here that by taking craft seriously, perhaps we can start probing the ways in which this perspective of dwelling and making can help us reimagine models of environmental protection, and perhaps can help us dwell otherwise. Thank you very much.
Okay, and lastly, we have Ilga. Ilga, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, so whenever you're ready.
Oh, is it sharing the screen, yeah?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, oops. Okay, there we go. Did it move forward? I can't see my screen anymore. Okay, so hopefully it's going to work. Yeah, so thank you so much for the opportunity to share this work and some of my thoughts around home, family, stitching, and borderlands. It's also so great to be back at Concordia University, where I have such fond memories from when I was a student. I was born in Montreal to parents who were born in Latvia, but I'm speaking to you now from a chilly London and windy. Artist and educator, my life has revolved around drawing for idea generation and drawing to see, or what Andrew Causey calls drawing as ethnographic method. I also wrote a book about my urban sketching practice published 2 years ago. At the moment, I am both staff and student at University of the Arts London, where my current research is about affective bloom spaces in education. Central to my story in this presentation today is a duality between this and that, my long-standing interest in home, the refugee story of my grandparents who fled their homes and designed a new life for themselves in exile. My interest in embroidery began in the summer of 2021, when I first laid eyes on this large tablecloth. My grandmother embroidered it in the late 1920s or early 1930s. It served as the starting point for a year-long collaboration with my late sister, Andra. We took rubbings from it, one of the many simple processes we did together and exhibited at 5 years in London last year. I should mention that the tablecloth is not a traditional Latvian design, but incorporates many stylized images of fruit and natural forms. My sister, who had stage 4 breast cancer, also saw many breasts in the design. That's a little short video of the rubbing. So I was doing a rubbing of the tablecloth. We are all a product of our upbringing. And here we are many years ago, spending time together, learning how to knit, stitch, sew, which my grandmother lovingly taught us. We kept our hands busy. I was actually really lucky to find this picture. I couldn't believe my luck. I just kind of happened to find it on my computer. In Canada, I grew up with many stories about home, the home they had to leave behind. There were also stories from my family's experience as displaced persons. One of these stories my grandmother told was about unpicking a black wool sweater in order to embroider this traditional linen shirt. Much later, she also made one for me, my mother, my sister. This is traditional dress from the Barta region, not far from Liepāja, where my grandmother was born. As a teenager, I wore this traditional dress for festivals and celebrations, performing my cultural identity. My grandparents probably rarely wore this traditional dress when they lived in Latvia, if ever. Their wedding photo in the top right corner shows them dressed in the typical 1930s fashion of the day. My grandmother Linda was a graduate of the Conservatory of Music in Riga and sang on stage. But it was another singer who I found on Instagram, Ukrainian Alina Pash, in the lower right, who spoke about why she wears traditional embroidery now. Pash changed how I saw the familiar embroidery I grew up with as continuity and resistance. Quoting Pash, she feels the support of her ancestors when she is performing. The embroidery is the code of our people and kind. I feel the wearing of this traditional dress was a form of belonging and resistance in my childhood too. On another Ukrainian social media account, I found this interesting discussion about the geographic border between ornamental, geometric, and organic patterns. Almost like the regional dialects, it was possible to identify where you are from based on the embroidery that you wear.
Zooming out from Ukrainian patterns, Sheila Payne's survey, Embroidered Textiles, covers Ukraine and the Baltic states, including Latvia, as well as the rest of the world. A guide to traditional patterns, which includes mythological symbols, religious and spiritual symbols, and devices that are protective as well as decorative. I'm sure all of us have our own stitch stories. I was invited as one of 3 artists to make new work in response to the Ruins exhibition last summer in Trapani, Sicily. Curator Anda Klavina wrote in the catalog, "Ruins are present while actually being from the past, standing between past and present, death and life, the conscious and the unconscious, expressed and sealed for eternity." The exhibition came at a time in my life of tremendous change, and when I began research in 2021, I was indeed thinking about the past. I visited Sicily for the first time, noticing with great interest my surroundings. My outlook changed in February 2022 when Russia invaded its neighbor Ukraine and the past became present. I felt I had to speak about the ruins I was seeing on the news every day. The title of my performance, Between Surface and Absorption, refers to different states of staying on the surface or being absorbed within. I'm thinking here of memory and layering of history, but also the quality of different art materials. Some stay on the surface while others are absorbed within. The surface as a border holding its integrity or fluid and transformed. This walk began on the surface. Our footsteps touch the pavement, drawing lines connecting us with this time and place. I recycled one of my old paintings, cutting it into the shape of an apron, washing it repeatedly to soften the surface. Then I embroidered it with the stitches I remembered from childhood, starting with the cross stitch, which was much harder than I thought it would be. This was the first time I had attempted embroidery since I was a teenager, and I placed no pressure on myself. It was more about the idea of the process rather than the finished result. I wore this apron for my walk from the gallery in the center of Trapani to the ruins of a tuna factory, a large abandoned territory just outside town, taking a route along the coast. The entire journey took about 1 hour, and we chose to start as the sun was setting to avoid the heat of the day. We were a group of 10, artists, curators, friends, and family, and our story began with footsteps that weave places together. I was reading Michel de Certeau at the time, and had added walking to my art practice during the COVID lockdowns. We became engineers cutting streets through to the past. I had reread Walter Benjamin's One-Way Street and its dedication to asialatis, which made me think about the impact we have on others and the urban surface of the street cut into and absorbed into the body. This was a protest walk, a demonstration of hope, what Rebecca Solnit thinks of as an active hope, taking a small step or small stitch towards hope. And Judith Butler writes, when bodies assemble in the street, in the square, or in other public venues, it is the exercise, one might call it performative, of the right to appear, a bodily demand for a more livable set of lives. This story of my family's exile and my own attempts at finding home have been at the forefront of my early creative practice, and I wonder if through embroidery, the slowness of the embroidery, and watching and feeling this year of aggression by a neighbor is a way back to this question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Can everyone hear me? Nope. Okay, so thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Michelle, Magdalena, and Ilga for such honestly wonderful, but also surprising. I think there were definitely some connections all throughout the four of you. Some more obvious one relating to territory and the mapping aspect, the topography, but also some other ideas like immersiveness into the ecology, I think also came up a little bit throughout all four of the presentations. And but I'm glad to announce we have a lot of time actually on our hands. So for questions, feel free to come up to the mic and ask away. So do we have any questions in the audience? Oh, sure.
I'll re-say the question, I guess, so everyone can hear. It was, how has our relationship to the specific site changed through the work? I guess for me, it has made me question my desire and intention. Something that comes up often is, I think, this like well-meaning kind of social activist question of like, well, let's get some attention on this and let's make change and let's get them to do something. I really had to interrogate that. Like, I think it's a place to stay with the trouble of being impure and imperfect and dirty nature. And how do we acknowledge the work of the plants, and how do we support that and be in reciprocal relationship with those plants, and to look in a critical way at what that kind of conservation work would look like in this place and how much negative impact and disruption that would have. And then just at a more practical level, being on the land like multiple times a week and really bringing this kind of intention, I think that I'm seeing life patterns of plants over years, cycles. I really felt the drought last year, especially trying to keep that goldenrod piece alive. And then the dyes that we were making, like blackberries, were part of it because the blackberries really take up the lead contamination in the soil as well. And so we were going to make blackberry dyes, but we had a drought. So there was so we could only make as much dye as we could ethically take plants, right? So it's made me very aware of the climate of that place.
Thank you. I guess for me, because, in some ways the river is 1,200 kilometers long from Lake Ontario through to the Gulf. So it's a big place of which I have no deep knowledge, no sense of ownership. I think what has changed for me is an increased understanding of the complexity of the many issues, many stakeholders, some well-meaning and do damage, some not well-meaning and do damage. Also, I've come to see, I suppose, the deep appreciation that people who are in some way connected to the river without an expertise have for the river. You know, the more I sit and work with people, you know, they'll say, well, you know, I did my whole MA thesis about issues like this, or I'll hear stories. So I'm very impressed by and in awe of the degree of embedded feeling, I suppose, affect, probably even love, that people in this part of the world and the people with whom I've connected have with the river. I guess I've also come to see what a raging amateur I am in terms of how little expertise I have. I'm good at a very small niche of things, and sometimes I think those actually even matter at all. So I try not to get too obsessed by that question, because I do think there is value in doing this work, even if it's not actually addressing some directly, it's not direct action. So I go back and forth with some of those things. I appreciate how complicated and difficult it is, and I keep seeing that more and more and more, but I keep wanting to do the work. So I guess, you know, it's not like the river's my bad boyfriend, but it's more that I really appreciate how much we have to learn, we meaning me, but we also a bigger we. And so the river is showing me that too.
Is it on? Okay. My question is for Magdalena. I was very touched by your description of how the basket weavers in gathering the junco were very sensitive to exactly which parts of a given plant could be used, that they would never just rip up a whole plant or saw it off, for instance, at the roots. And it put me in mind of the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. She's also if I can say, Western-trained scientist, and her work showed that the sweetgrass prospered best not when it was left completely alone, and not when it was cultivated as a commercial garden, but when the people who knew how to pick it, picked it in a selective and respectful way. So that was an extremely interesting parallel, but the people who live on those lagoons, I was wondering what your thoughts might be about this pattern of sort of these foundations, or if I can say authoritarian organisms, trying to tell the people who are in direct contact with the living beings how and what to do, instead of listening to them about how the plants speak to us. I'm just curious about your thoughts on how does one go about trying to dissolve the conflict or resolve the tension, or I hope my question is clear. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a wonderful question. And yes, absolutely. I think that the work of these basket makers is part of this multi-species relationality of the lagoon. They help the lagoon grow. They are doing the environmental work in this waterscape. And I mean, the second part of your question is wonderful. I at the moment I have no answer to this. There is a lot of community consultations. There are these meetings in the local community center and workshops and design thinking. But unfortunately, the hierarchy of knowledge prevails. So the expert, the UN expert, the biologist, and the fisherman or the weaver don't really sit in the same, they don't have the same status in these conversations. And what I want to show by my work is to really just tell stories that maybe in some way argue powerfully or more powerfully than these community consultations that become very conflicting spaces, that there is something else that's going on there, that there is this knowledge, and Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote about it also very, very beautifully, that really needs to, it's an embodied knowledge, inhabited, very attentive to every single change in this environment. They know exactly when the canals come with polluted water because they know the plants, they know what's happening 2 weeks later. If only this knowledge could become part of this wider environmental agenda, that would be fantastic. And I think this is, again, a question about how we do environmental protection and how we bring all these minuscule but extremely important voices into practices and especially into models. As anthropologists always have problems with these global models. We need to create models that are localized, that are really part of the context. Sorry, I probably didn't answer your question.
Any other questions? Anyone else? Well, maybe I can ask Ilga a question about the duality that you mentioned, and also citing Tim Ingold and the immersiveness of craft. I just wanted to kind of inquire you on what that meant for you personally, this duality between the sense of belonging and the memory that you have of craft in your family. So if you could just elaborate a little more on your experience with that duality.
Yeah, I mean, I did, when I was a Concordia student, I actually did my thesis on the duality of the immigration story of George Lagrady's anecdoted archive from the Cold War. I think it was a work that he did where he basically took his family's belongings and he put them into a museum in Budapest. I'm speaking from memory right now, but it was something like that. But just to say that I think I've always had that kind of understanding growing up, which is not just unique to me, but growing up in a family where we spoke a language at home, and you know, all my social life and everything, it was always like these kind of two parallel lives. In my early kind of childhood, and then when I was kind of a student, I went and lived in Latvia, and it was this kind of reverse duality that I thought I was going home, but actually the place was very different to the place I had heard of in my grandmother's stories. So I guess I've been kind of saturated with that up until recently. That's why I said I kind of ended my presentation on the question, because I think that I think I need to speak about this. You know, for about 20 years I've lived in London, and maybe it was a move to a different location, a different place that kind of enabled me to let go of these questions of home and belonging, building a new life, building a new kind of identity for myself. And I think that's that perhaps it was this looking back, you know, the grandmother's tablecloth, the story with my sister, finding that photograph of us, me embroidering when I was probably about 12 years old, my sister knitting, and I think my grandmother's doing crochet, was that, you know, it's nothing, you can't, you know, you can never, it is a part of you, you know, you can never escape. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but elaborated.
Magdalena, did you have a question? I see your Zoom hand up.
If there's no questions from the room, but I'm happy to ask it later.
We do have a question from chat just now. So can the idea of reciprocity apply in your situation, Magda? what could reciprocity mean in dealing with our relationships and collaborations with the human and non-human?
I think there is already a lot of reciprocity, and this is my discussion about collecting. I mean, coming from museum studies, we really think about collecting in terms of loot, in terms of extraction. Collecting has a lot to do with this extractive capitalism and histories of colonialism. But here we have a very, very different form of collecting. It's a reciprocal practice. It's an embodied practice. So people are giving seeds to the land as they're collecting plants. They are making choices based on respectful multi-species relationships with the place, and they will never extract beyond what will not help a certain site grow. So definitely, I think we can learn from craft to learn about collecting otherwise, and perhaps we can rethink museums, we can rethink other collecting spaces and institutions through these reciprocal practices that are developed in such small pockets like craft practices.
This isn't a question, it's more of a comment that one of the things that craft always struggles with is the fact that craft is labor, and it's always seen as a lesser activity than an intellectual one. So I'm suggesting in Magda's situation that she has scientists who are trained in ecology, and therefore they are seeing their mind or intelligent work as far superior to the labor work that the craftspeople are doing. And this is an ongoing situation that we're finding not only in conservation situations, but in universities, in the public sphere, in how parents are recommending their children not to do a trade. So it's a far reaching problem for craft.
I agree, and I think the task for us is to really re-evaluate craft, see craft as form of knowledge production that can contribute. We, especially speaking from a context of Germany, where science was part of extremely violent practices, extractive, but also destructive, we can perhaps turn to something else. And craft could be one of those. I'm sometimes using the metaphor of prefiguration from anarchist practices. So this making futures otherwise here, now, and through small examples. Craft really offers these alternatives, but we need to really constantly advocate for its value.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your questions. Any more comments or questions? And panelists, feel free to ask each other questions as well. Oh, Magdalena, sorry, you also had a question that we didn't get to.
Just a very short one, I'm aware of time, but I loved Kathleen's paper, and I was thinking about your work about crafting with light and crafting with needle. And I just was curious about how how this technique emerged. It's such a beautiful combination. Cyanotype and embroidery.
I think it's because I've always had, a kind of a photographic stream to my understanding as well as a needlework stream. And, thinking about family histories, it's my two parents. My father was the photographer, and I always would inherit from him when he, kind of cycled up to a new camera. I would get the old camera, which was very exciting for me. And I had a very beloved step-grandmother who did a lot of the training of me and gave me a lot of her wool, and I still have some of her patterns from the 1940s and things. And so there are ways that are very central to my understanding through my entire decades of life now. And so I guess when I'm working on something that's particularly important to me, I go back to those deeply rooted practices and ways of being in the world. Just as you were saying about the embroidery, the stuff coming back through time. So I think in a certain way, for me, they did. But I wanted each of those practices, the cyanotype and the needlework, also allows other non-expert artists to participate. And I think that was also very important to me, the non-experts being the plants, at least non-experts in our evaluation scheme. We probably have some reordering of that scheme to do as well. And then inclusivity in terms of needlework. Anybody who was willing to work with a needle and thread can work on the project. So I think those two things, the sort of the family histories and the desire for inclusivity beyond my imaginings of surprise. Thanks for the question.
Well, thank you for all the questions. Thank you for everyone's input. The next session will be in 15 minutes, so we'll see you there. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
So just for everybody, there's coffee and refreshments on the other side of the screen. You can help yourselves to that, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Lauren Leone is an artist, art therapist, and mental health counselor whose interests include the therapeutic benefits of craft materials and media for art therapy practice, socially engaged craft practices, and how craft activism can support art therapy practitioners and participants in being change agents. And last but not least, Shelley Gable-Parker, did I say that right? is an artist, art therapist, licensed clinical social worker, and an associate professor. Her scholarship is engaged with liberation pedagogy, community development, and public art therapy practices. So during this talk, as mentioned, we'll be embroidering on some recycled fabric from Concordia's Center for Creative Reuse. And so you are, of course, still welcome to come up and grab some things, a fabric, some needle, thread. We've also got scissors, and feel very welcome to stitch with us. And with that, I will pass it over to you folks. Let me just figure out how to share my screen.
Yes, would you do that? Of course. As Tori is putting up our PowerPoint, which we didn't intend to have a PowerPoint, but because everybody did, we last minute, Lauren put it together. Thank you, Lauren. We also didn't realize that there would be an online component to this, so it would be good for people to see the images. We also have brought our own work, some of the images that you would see, the embroidered images that will get passed around. And each of us will kind of speak a little bit to those images. Before I start, I wanted to thank the organizers here, Molly. Thank you so much for inviting us. And this has been, it's wonderful to be here and hear all of the wonderful research and personal projects that have been going on. And I'm hoping that we will all add to what we've just been hearing all this time. And we also want to thank Concordia, as well as, you know, all three of us have been at Concordia many times because of Art Hives. And so we're very happy that Janice is here, and also Rachel is here. And Momo, okay, I don't know Momo, hi. Who already do a lot of work around art and Art Hives here, and the fibers is a specific component of that work you all do too. So we can talk, I think there'll be questions about this later. So I am Savneet Tawar, and I am going to begin by talking about stitching stories and how we're thinking about a feminist care pedagogy.
so much of that has already been happening today, whether it was the lunch this afternoon that was so beautiful and invoking of grandmothers, mothers, families and family history and lineages. I also am going to be adding to some of the stories that have already been told. I do both community work as well as work individually on my own art practice. I feel very privileged to have had a year off with sabbatical and time to just really slow down and begin to think a little bit more about my own art practice. So today I'll just talk a little bit more about ways in which I'm thinking about mapping memory. And before I say that, I think there's a lot that's been highlighted today in relationship to belonging, land, lineage, naming, this idea of mending. There's been this wonderful person who's been in the audience who's been mending all day. So hello to this person. I don't know who they are, but I have seen them mending all through the entire day. So thinking about crafting as homemaking and something that I've been thinking a lot for myself, this idea of searching for home and what that may mean. So when we wrote this proposal, we talked a little bit about the crafting body, how often that's been sort of this hunched over body, sort of this very invisibilized labor, but also very gendered form of labor. But that is also all the parts of that is about engagement in mending, repairing, and making. And how much of those spaces we've all learned in, and I personally also will speak about learning from my mother, my cousins, and the importance of naming this, because as long as we don't name it, it stays invisible. So creating with hands, revisiting historical past, really thinking through some of my own lineage and some of the spaces that I had never investigated before. Most of my own study currently has been around abolition. And so also been thinking about the relationship between abolition as a form of understanding our relationship to land in lineage. So this is an image of a map that I made this past fall that really looks at the relationship of my own origins. In 1947, when the British left India, India was divided into Pakistan. There was a portion of land that went into the formation of Pakistan, which was on ethno-religious basis. And the loss of land that happened affected my family. Now, I've always thought that it only affected a handful of people, but in a recent presentation in India, I realized that many people have a story around partition. And that was so beautiful to actually connect with other people. So I've been thinking a lot about this notion of partition, what it means when maps are drawn. And we call this the crooked line that has impacted our bodies, our land, our relationship to land. Some of the more recent work by Kara Page and Erica Woodland in their book called Healing Justice Lineages, they speak a lot about the relationship between land and wounding, and how much of that intergenerational trauma that we have carried in our own bodies. And when I think of home, I always think of my own body, like where does my body reside and what needs to be remembered? So in relationship to that, I've been looking a lot about, I shouldn't say this is a new thing, but I've been doing this for a long time about this, living on both sides of the hyphen of being Indian and American. I've lived in the United States now for 36 years. So this relationship about living on both sides of the hyphen, how much of my upbringing in India and then now residing in the United States through all of this crafting work is really about searching for home. And the idea of mending. So that comes to mind a lot. And I did this little piece that was not too long ago as I've begun to think about creating community mending workshops. And as I think about mending, I begin to think about what needs revision, right? What are these repetitions that I continue to revisit? But what are these scenarios and stories that need revisiting and recrafting? As Erica Woodland and Kara Page will speak about, they speak a lot to the notion of what must be remembered, what must be repaired, and what needs to be reconnected. So we continuously see now the recognition of the fact that we are on uninvited land, the land recognizing where we are in land acknowledgements. And of course, there's a lot of critique around the fact that this is just very performative. And the positive aspect of it is that if we never ever verbalize, if we never ever remember, then we continue to live on land and not acknowledge the ways in which that wounding has impacted people and how some of that wounding also resides in our own body. How do we connect to that wounding and how do we really heal? So in thinking about what needs mending, I created this not as a linear idea, but as something that can only be, that only registers when you actually have to solve this and say, what is this? And I have to read it out and say, M-E, me, and mend, right? So me and so I play, it's a play on words, and yet the slow process of embroidering really is the idea of rethinking what needs mending. I attribute a lot of my work to my mother and everything that I learned from her. Which are, and all the spaces in which I resisted what my mother had to teach me, or the areas she felt that I didn't comply. So I just want to recognize her, a number of my cousins, my aunts who I learned from. I did this when my mother passed away because I think in some sense I needed to write out her name as a way to remember through crafting what this meant for me. So to me, the crafting is also a process where processing grief, processing our own memories becomes an important place. So crafting is just an everyday thing in my life. And through this process, when I used to go visit my mother in her later years, she insisted that I take with me some of her own embroidered pieces. So this piece is it's actually a tray cover that she had embroidered. And these were embroidered when she was a young woman before she got married. And a lot of her designs, if I look back, are very colonial designs. Coming from the state of Punjab, there's a very specific kind of embroidery that was very prominent. And my mother came from a middle-class family with lots of access. And so I've been re-engaging with her own embroidered pieces, and on top of that, embroidering some of the ways in which I'm thinking about healing in relationship to land. And this piece also is another map piece that I have embroidered on top of, in the middle of her piece, to reappropriate this notion of how much of colonialism really influenced how we lived and what that might have been. Some of the inherited knowledge, some of these inherited narratives, as I call them, that I have brought with me and never questioned them. And so this piece is called The Crooked Line, and it's the Radcliffe line. And the story behind this goes as Cyril Radcliffe, who was a British minister who came to India at the time of partition, and he was instilled with the duty to actually create the partition between India and Pakistan. And he literally came 4 weeks before this partition happened, and within those 4 weeks, demarcated lines that really changed the lives of people. My families both came from Pakistan. My father's family came as refugees and lived in India. And one of the stories, so in the years I grew up, my father's stories were not necessarily stories of hardship, but they were always about hope. And I thought that that's such an interesting piece in relationship to understanding how people heal and how we make meaning in our own lives. So the impact of this partition was devastating. There were about 1 million people who were killed and 20 million who were dislocated. And in understanding that in today's day and time, I have very few images to understand this memory. And I bring this in relationship to understanding how much of our own lives in today's day and time are mediated through memories. Our memories are mediated through images. So I began looking at images from 1947 when partition happened, and some of the images that had been prominent in my life that I remembered. And this is one image that I remember as a child looking at, and that instilled a sense of homelessness for me. So I have taken this image and I've started to craft this image in various different ways. One of the ways in which I've done this is through, again, taking one of my mother's handcrafted napkins and hand sewn this particular image, and then taken this image further into our Ruby embroidery machine as a way to look at what technology is doing in terms of images. And then superimposing upon this the various maps that have determined who we are as individuals. So I'm going to stop here. I'll stop by this last piece that I would like to talk about. Is the last piece that I want to leave everybody with is this idea of memory work, and how important it is for us to not only honor our memories and our histories and do it communally. So going back again to Kara Page, she speaks about how memory work can show us what is possible when revolutionary care is at the center of our liberation. So I will stop here.
Thanks. Yeah, that's what I thought.
I guess I'm next. We really took the kitchen table thing seriously. All right. Hi, I'm Lauren Leone. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an art therapist. Thank you for introducing me earlier, Tori. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how craft and home have intersected for me in the context of chronic illness. So some of this is kind of in a literal sense of just being home when I'm not feeling well, not following through on plans that I thought I would be doing because I'm not feeling well. Also thinking about feeling not at home in my body, how chronic illness can be uncomfortable, unpredictable, inhospitable sometimes. And so there's this urge to split mind and body, and thinking about how craft helps me keep those together. And also just thinking about how craft can nurture well-being, and thinking about the sensory and kinesthetic processes of stitching, and then also how things like repetition, rhythm, and the quality of the materials that I use can facilitate comfort. And then also how the process can help me make meaning of something that can feel confounding, can give me a sense of agency and control. Also thinking about medical homes, which is a term that is used, and just sort of navigating inhospitable spaces in medicine and using craft as a way to reflect, a way to humanize myself and others, definitely as a way to find humor and sort of to soften the process. So finding some comfort and discomfort, and finding humor in humorless settings. So one thing I've been doing recently, which I am not going to show, but is taking photos of the floor or ceiling when I'm in offices. So if I'm having, like I took a picture of my chiropractor's office and it was a drop ceiling and it looks like a quilt. And so I made a quilt based on that. And so just kind of decontextualizing and recontextualizing things in settings that don't feel very comfy or cozy. And then finally is finding home online with others. And this really happened through the pandemic and just sort of how we began to be able to do more things that were decentralized and meet people from other geographic regions, and how craft was a way to build community, not just in general, but with other folks with chronic illness, and how there has been this process of storytelling and witnessing through our craft practice online, and also how it's become clearer to me the sort of interconnection between individual and community healing when it was put against something as dramatic and as widespread as the pandemic. So I'm going to show a video and then I'll talk a little bit about it afterwards. don't know if you could. Can you hear me through it? Oh. Okay, that's better. I was going through my speakers. I don't know how well you could hear that song, but shout out to Mike, my husband, who is in the audience, who created the music for that. But this video was of an embroidery I made in the summer of 2020, and it was for a project called Disability Culture, CRIP, and Ally Care Exchange, and that was created by two art therapists in Chicago, Sandy Yee and Catherine Haupt, who are actually former students of Sevnitz and current colleagues of Sevnitz. And the idea was to get pairs of disabled artists and non-disabled artists together to create art together as a form of care. And also, this was really early on in the pandemic when there was a lot of discussion about triaging and how people who are disabled or had chronic illness may be triaged out of being on ventilators, et cetera. And so there were different prompts, and there was one about nobody is disposable, and that's the one I chose. And my partner in this project, Lauren Rose, also has a lot of chronic illness, but what was interesting is that neither one of us knew which one of us was the disabled artist and which was the non-disabled artist, and it was because both of us had this internalized ableism, and both were dealing with chronic illness, but weren't naming it as disability. And so through the process of making art together, we really started to reflect on internalized ableism, internalized capitalism, neoliberalism, productivity culture, just all the things that were getting in the way of us taking care of ourselves in the way that we wanted to, we would like to. And so I read an essay by Ellen Samuels that's called 6 Ways of Thinking About Crip Time, and crip time is short for crippled time. And it is within disability culture, this idea of bending time to your body versus bending your body to time. So in general, thought of as an empowering thing, but Ellen wrote this article also about grief and loss and sort of how dealing with chronic illness was impacting their understanding of that. And so this project, this video was of an embroidery I made kind of reflecting on that. And then as part of, oops, hold on, how do I get to the next slide? Here we go. As part of this project, my partner in the project also made a video, and then here are some detail shots of a piece I made, which was just embroidering stills of her from the video, which was another way of witnessing and bearing witness. And so this was a really important dialogue that we kept up for about a year and really changed. Like in reality, I'd been making art about health and chronic illness for a decade, but not really owning that. And so using stitching as a way to find dialogue, as a way to witness each other, as a way to take care of each other and take care of ourselves was really pivotal for me. And we talk about art therapy, in art therapy, we talk about witnessing a lot. And this project really allowed me to understand on a deep embodied level how collaborating and bearing witness can be a way of taking care of each other and ourselves. And I think that's all I'm gonna say about this. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk about, I'm gonna skip over this and we put this deck together at lunch, so there are some errors here. So anyway, disregard that top thing. I'm going to talk about 3 books I made this fall that are all exploring chronic illness. Again, I read a book called The Invisible Kingdom by Megan O'Rourke that really, really resonated with me. And so the first book, which is called Not All the Time, which is a phrase from within her book, is pairing different phrases that resonated with me and sort of mundane everyday things related to illness that I have around me. I decontextualize them through doing contour drawings and then embroidering the contour drawings and kind of finding new shapes and meanings and stories and finding some beauty in them. And again, this theme of trying to make sense of things that don't make sense, so finding beauty and humor in objects that also give me an appreciation for them, where maybe I see them as like something I'm resentful of, or maybe even kind of ugly on the day-to-day. And this line from Megan O'Rourke's book really struck me. Many see their illness as a form of personal failure requiring self-indictment. And I think one thing I've really been focusing on in the last 3 or 4 years, and thinking more about chronic illness and ability and disability, is how we are taught to see illness as a personal failure, and how that relates to neoliberal projects of sort of overcoming illness, of needing to be well, like not so you can connect with your family or do the things you love, but so that you can work and produce and be a good buddy in that way. So lots of stuff coming up. And then another quote that I think really typifies this experience of chronic illness, which is, and especially around autoimmunity, when the immune system attacks the body. Oops, all right, I'll wrap it up. Instead of defending it, it feels natural to experience this as a betrayal in which we are both betrayer and betrayed. And so just, I think all of these books, I'll just flip through the images quickly, are kind of trying to make sense of that. So this is another one I made, and we have work that we'll pass around, so I'll pass these books around. But this was basically in my electronic medical records portal. There is a tab called My Conditions. And so I went in and looked at all my conditions, and they're all the ICD diagnosis numbers, and there are a lot. And I took them all out and I typed them out, and then I scrambled them, and then I embroidered them and made this book. And just this idea of like trying to keep track of symptoms, trying to keep track of like instructions, like you see one doctor and they give you a list of 5 things to do. Meanwhile, you've seen 5 other doctors that also give you 5 things to do. And just make meaning of things that never have clarity, and sort of the fatigue that comes with that. And this was in an exhibition in like October or November, and it was really interesting to watch people read it and try to decode it and figure it out, and just how much that resonated for what that experience is like. And then this is a third book, which I called Unintelligible Transmissions, and just thinking about what's being passed down, what's transmitted when things aren't directly spoken about. So thinking about intergenerational and historical trauma, and then also coming back to the idea of symptoms and how they relate to this, and the vigilance that comes from trying to decode and understand and predict. And then just this last quote, which is from Ellen Samuels' essay, "Crip time insists that we listen to our body minds so closely, so attentively in a culture that tells us to divide the two and push the body away from us while also pushing it beyond its limits. Crip time means listening to the broken languages of our bodies, translating them, honoring their words." And I just really like that, how that encapsulates so much of this, and how craft allows me to do that by taking a step back, by having a comforting process, and also by having community, which maybe I'll talk about later if we have time, but I'll pass on to Shelley.
It's been such just a pleasure to be here. I've been appreciating all of this experience, reconnecting with old friends, as well as just getting to continue to think together with some wonderful minds. And then the inspiration from everybody's work so far has just been so heartening. My name is Shelley Gable Parker. I'm she, her pronouns. I'm from a part of the United States where we have these 2 great rivers that are in the United States. The Mississippi and the Missouri come together at a confluence. St. Louis is below it. The university I teach at Southern Illinois University is on the other side of that Mississippi, but it's in that image on the right. A lot of my work is done in the context of teaching, and with my students, we create a lot of making spaces. I support students working in field work, as well as in practicum, and also in community-based service learning work that I do with community artists in our region. The part of the land that we're from is unceded territory to many tribes because of those 2 rivers coming together, or many indigenous people who would come together. There's an old UNESCO World Heritage Site called Cahokia there, which I would invite all of you to come visit and let me know if you're coming. I'd love to host you. That is an ancient peoples that came before the the Missouri, the Illinois Confederacy, which is a whole group of tribes, as well as the Osage, which are a large part of that territory. And a lot of my work is also done in honor of, and I provide donations to an organization called the Booter Center, which is from my old social work school. There's a lot of training Indigenous people who go back into their areas and communities to do better culturally centered care work. So that's a context for you. And then it's been so nice to be able to share thinking about personal artwork too. So I brought some things. Next slide. So one of the things I brought, speaking of homely items, this is something that gets used every day in my house. In fact, I thought, oh, my partner's going to miss this morning. He's going to be, where did the tea cozy go? Mark Arnold is the potter who created that beautiful little teapot. He graduated from our university with his MFA. And I bought this teapot really close to the beginning, before the pandemic came. So I was really in love with it. And then as we were all sort of in our modes, as many people have revisited already in their conversations of trying to calm ourselves down and to pay attention to what we needed to do next, I found that tea making was super important to me. And, you know, probably the only thing that came before some art making and being with those people that I love, that I could be, whether it was in person and or, you know, electronically like so many of us were doing, or on the phone for the old-fashioned people in the room too. So I created this tea cozy in honor, an homage to this teapot that was bringing me such joy. So that, oh, sorry, yes, I'm happy to pass around. It is very beaten up, and I plan to do some more work on it to sort of help it survive longer too. It is gonna be continually mended. A lot of my work is a continual, I call them my perpetual projects. So this is a bag that also, let's see if I, yes. So I've got images there from other things that happen. The kind of way that I work, my artwork is very much embedded in my day-to-day life and in my living. So sweaters that I like to creative repair, repurposing, not just sweater, but other objects too. This bag, which was an artist-made bag that I loved so much I did not want to part with, and so I've continued to work on and heal. It does this when it gets washed, so and so it sometimes isn't installations as it is in that image there, holding plants. That is a rosemary plant to consider remembrance, also along the same themes so many of you all have talked about. Happy to pass that guy. I also brought a blanket that I had made when I lost my brother a number of years ago, again along the themes of grief. And those of you who have had personal losses know that along with that, as experts in this work say all the time, that we don't end relationships with people when they die, we are continually changing those relationships. And so this really represents a reflection work I do on my relationship with my brother, who was people all the time thought we were twins. He was a head and a half taller than I, but we look very much alike. And I say as I age, I think I look more like him all the time. But so it was sort of made from some pieces of clothing that he had. But what I have learned now, a decade in, is how much joy this brings me too, which is really a part of grieving that we don't talk about very much, but it is a piece of the process, in addition to just the experience of loss and losing. But recognizing that we had too. So another way I like to work is just in a diary way. So this is from my work in the art hives yesterday. I was working on the teacup that I was drinking out of, making that image in embroidery. So this idea of sort of being with and sitting with what's present and with me. So I'm going to, since I need to take a breath, I'm going to invite you all to breathe with me a little bit. Speaking of embodiedness, let's do a couple of those. And so one of the things, and I feel like I saw these themes show up again and again, really in the early morning conversation. Here, I don't know if there's a needle in there. Will you make sure nobody gets stuck? These are from feminist theory, the work of the Wellesley Centers, the Jean Baker Miller Center. There's, and this is Judith Jordan's book, Relational Cultural Theory. One of the therapy sort of theories that we work out of, they talk about the 5 good things being what, when we heal and when we have well-being, we have these. It's a really nice, I think, again, referring to what Lauren was just talking about too, this sense of how we let our body tell us whether we are on the right track. So are we feeling that zest, energy that an experience is giving us, or are we feeling drained? You know, are we having more clarity, knowledge? You know, I'm just listening to your talk too, this idea of what brings clarity and what is out of what is confusing and hazy. That sense of worth, the idea that, you know, whether it's fine art, whether it's craft, whether it's, you know, worth talking, this idea that this is worthy, that something, that we are worthy, that the ideas we're talking about, the things we're talking about are worthy. Again, productivity, so this is a little bit of that culture in there, but it's embedded in this idea that we want to work, we want to get our hands in things and get to work together. And then that we want to be in connection with one another, that those things are signs that we are feeling well. So, Janice is here at the table. Art Hives has been a big practice. I mentioned I teach field work. One of the things I'm doing is, this is the first year I've taken this public practice work that I've been doing and really started to embed it into our curriculum. So I've been thinking deeply about it a lot and about what people can learn from the spaces that we're in when we create these wonderful spaces that my colleagues have taught other people how to create. If you have never heard of Art Hives, I encourage you to check it out. And also you're at the epicenter. So if you're from out of town, go visit an art hive, or even if you are from in town. So this idea of working alongside my students, the sense of being with others, as many people have repeated over and over again, that the idea of the slow pace of engaging in work, being quietly reflective or chattery or drinking your cup of coffee or tea or water, you know, those things, that kind of space that we create together, a kitchen table space, if you will, is such a critically important piece of learning how to help us with mending and healing ourselves, our culture, our world, right? And there's always a moment in the art hive that I'd say it's about 25 minutes in, I feel like, once I've finally sort of settled in, I find myself go, sink in a little bit to my body, to that home space of my body. And I notice it in others. I watch that happen over and over again with others. So how about that? Right on time.
Thank you three so much.
Do we have time for
We
Q&A?
do. We've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Fantastic. So I will maybe steal my laptop back so I can field some questions from Zoom if there's any questions from our folks online, but also very welcoming to questions from the audience. Maybe you can raise your hand, or because this is a kitchen table talk, feel welcome to come up and have a chat and ask us questions. Yeah.
Thanks so much to everyone who shared. Many of you talked about slowing down, or part of a crip, a way of working being about digging out the capitalism that is so inherent in a lot of this work. And, you know, this is a really beautiful space and event, but it's also still an academic one. And I was wondering if you could sort of weigh in and think about the pressure and the tensions that come along with thinking through these embodied practices that are trying to do this CRIP work.
Go ahead. I have a lot.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm gonna collect myself.
That's an amazing question you've just asked, and I think all three of us could actually speak to our community practice that we have not talked about. And you are right that we are in academic settings, and that it's very important for us to acknowledge how and where we get to present, and how and where we get to make understand methodology, or even question, what is methodology, right? It's such a privileged space to be in. So with that said, I'm going to acknowledge that, but I do know that you've been doing a lot of work around that. And I can speak a little bit about my So Design Studio group, which is primarily with
in academic spaces and also in creative